so you'll suddenly see a switch to proper comparing, and it's going to be very exciting. And then I'll introduce our first performer, who's down here, who has brought an amazing child with them. Let's just find out. Raise your hand if you've brought a pet with you. Yes, we're pet friendly. This is great. What have you got hidden? Oh no, I see. Oh dear, that's very nice. So that's the base level. Let's move it up one. Who's brought a child? I was chatting to Ed, the sound man, and he said, I'm having such problems sleeping. I've just got a puppy. And I said, I'll see your puppy and raise you twin toddlers. Yeah, that's why I look so old. Right, we're going live. We're going live on the internet now, so we're going to do some proper things. Hello, internet viewers, wherever you are. Hello, internet viewers. Hello, live in the room. My name's Steve Cross. This is the professional comparing style that you were waiting for. Halfway between primary school and darts caller. That is where I'm going. Welcome to Sunday Papers Live, the Sunday afternoon experience where we go to a place that in our head we still think is really scary. But that's because we haven't been here for 10 to 15 years. And actually it's really nice around here now. And we recreate the experience of reading the Sunday papers, except we do it without the papers, with a much bigger living room, with loads of strangers in it, and with no opinion columns written by absolute bellends. So you don't get the full Sunday paper experience, but it's kind of like the best bits, let's say. So we've got a number of wonderful speakers today, each of whom represents a section of our fictional newspaper. And I've brilliantly remembered the name of our first person, but not what section they are. Travel. Your travel now. She's going to be travel now, because it's about travel. I mean, it might be UK news, I don't... They're always loosely interpreted. This is my, 400th Sunday Papers Live. Pretty much everybody's been travel at some point, so we'll go with travel. And it's very exciting to be here, because this isn't where I live. I don't know if any of you do live in this building, but for the rest of us, what a treat to not be in our houses. It's absolutely marvellous. This is the furthest I've been, past the end of my street for a very, very long time. I used to do things like, on a Saturday, just think, do you know what? I'll go to Brighton. Now I think, can I be bothered to go to Sainsbury's? And that's partly COVID and partly twin toddlers. Can you imagine, because we're potty training one, can you imagine how many pairs of pants and trousers I would have to change on a train from London to Brighton and back? That's the whole day. Also, that train is being taken out of service immediately afterwards. We're not doing that. So it's incredibly exciting. Sonia has been travelling around and has put together her experiences and has come to give us advice on if we are going to go further than the end of our streets, where should we go and what should we do? So some of you might know, because you've been here before, but I have very strict comparing rules. And the comparing rules are, when I introduce somebody who's going to speak, I need you to clap and cheer wildly. So wildly that kids playing in the adventure playground opposite stop because they think someone is having more fun than them, and they're in an adventure playground, right? That is the level of excitement I want. People on the internet, you can also clap and cheer wherever you are. I want your neighbours banging on the wall and telling you off for having too much enjoyment. And they think you're watching sport. And they're like, how can they afford a Sky subscription? They've got a rubbish car. That's the sort of thing that we want. So, lovely people, are you ready? Let's test the energy level. Has everyone had a drink? Are you ready to meet your travel editor? No. Good. I know that the front couple of rows here is experienced Sunday Papers Live. Behind, I think we've got a lot of what I'm going to describe as newbies. Newbies, you need to do way more than that. Otherwise, the whole day consists of me stopping you and telling you it wasn't good enough, and we never get any speakers on. And you're like, what was Sunday Papers Live? Oh, it's this incredible Dadaist performance where a man keeps saying YouTube and telling us off for not clapping properly. So let's try again. Lovely people, are you ready to meet your travel editor? Would you please welcome to the stage Sonia Barber?
Oh, hello. Just trying to decide if I'm going to stand or sit. I might sit down. You're all sitting. I'll just, sit down here. Hi, I am Sonia Barber. I'm a writer and journalist. First off, I have to say that I have an 8-month-old. She is here in the front row, and she has inherited my fear of missing out. So basically, she's not sleeping at the moment at all. So apologies in advance if I'm a little bit bleary and sleep deprived because, yeah. Also, this is the first time I've brushed my hair and put on makeup in about 8 months, so you're welcome. Thanks. So yeah, I'm here because I've just actually had another baby. So this is my book, and it's called Escape London, An Opinionated Guide, and it's basically a personal edit of the day trips that I've done near London in the last year or so. So this might not sound very radical, or I mean, especially if you compare me to like real explorers, like you're going to be hearing talk later, who go off into mountains without phones and stuff. Yeah, but for me, I guess it's been part of a bigger journey, and I guess that's what I'd like to tell you about today. So I used to be the Queen of London. Okay, so not actually the Queen of London, but like a self-proclaimed London expert. So I like to boast how I was born in Zone 1 and I never really left. I went to school in Camden. I used to go into town every weekend, buy sparkly tights in Soho. And then I worked at Time Out for pretty much all of my 20s and a lot of my 30s. So Time Out, writing about London. So yeah, and I basically made it was my business to know where to go out to eat and to drink and to dance and to, have a chilled Sunday watching people talk like this. And this was the kind of stuff that I was my bread and butter. And yeah, I used to edit the Time Out blog. Now, blog is a bit back when blogs were a thing. People had those, which meant that I was kind of out every single night going to pop-ups and experiential theatre where you had to pretend to be a chat show host and working in a kebab shop or I don't know, those kind of things. And yeah, I was just generally out and about a lot, and my weekends were full of going to new restaurants and going out dancing. And to be honest, it's making me tired just actually reading this list of things because I was very busy. And then actually my dad died, and he died really suddenly in 2017. And a few months later, I actually left Time Out. I took voluntary redundancy, and I think actually I was actually just very tired, and I just sort of needed to slow down a little bit. So yeah, by then I was in my mid-30s, and I was a bit more sedate than I was earlier. But my love affair for London was still going really strong. It was around this time that I actually wrote my first book, which is about places that I love in East London. Also a Hoxton Mini Press book, available at all good bookshops. And so yeah, I don't know if it's clear, but I really love London. So no disrespect to London for me writing a book about how to leave it. So, yeah, I mean, my byline at Time Out used to be that I spontaneously combusted if I left the M25, so that's how much I love London. But yeah, I mean, I felt really at that time like London was the only place I could be. But then my weekends did start to change, and I don't know whether that was kind of a bit of burnout, my age, or just sort of a general shift. But instead of always going to, I don't know, Broadway Market on a Saturday and Columbia Road on a Sunday and then brunching and mooching around art galleries, I guess I started to need something that I actually couldn't really find in London. And I think maybe I did get bored of going to the same old spots, and I needed something new and different. So I'm a big fan of swimming. Any swimmers, dry robers in the house here? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I used to love swimming in the city, but I started to sort of crave the wildness of the sea and river swims. And London feels Lido, and even Hampstead Pottons just weren't really doing it for me in the way that they used to. And I guess I just wanted fresher air and wider horizons and kind of greener spaces. And I was sort of less into cool new places and into cool older places. And I wanted to go to weird 1960s ice cream parlors and seaside charity shops and that kind of thing. So yeah, and it kind of discovering these new places outside of London became a kind of addictive thrill for me in the same way that I guess discovering new places in London had once been. So yeah, and I kind of realized, I guess, at that point that my London-centric view had actually been really limiting me, and there was so much very near London that could, it wasn't very far to feel very far away from the city. Yeah, and then I guess COVID hit. So I know we're all really bored of lockdown chat, but that is an integral part of the story, so I'll just go quickly. So yeah, that freaky weekend just before the first lockdown. We were actually in a cabin, me and my boyfriend were in a cabin in Norfolk with very little phone signal. And instead of, I don't know, switching off and, you know, being at one with nature, I was just like doom scrolling on my phone, and there was no signal apart from when I lay down on the bathroom floor. So I was just like there for like the whole weekend in this beautiful cabin. And so, like, as we drove back into the city, it was kind of, I mean, you'll remember, it was really terrifying. No one knew what was going to happen. And, I mean, after, like, a quick stop in, like, one of the most depressing local shops ever to buy, like, tinned beans and everything that we are still working our way through, those dried goods that I bought in that shop. Yeah, I mean, basically, when we got back to the city, we just had no idea when we would be able to leave again. And so then, obviously, you know, it was like 2 months of really horrible news, of incredible weather, and not really going further than, you know, the few streets around your house. And I guess my tiny flat in Hackney, which had always felt like an amazing, you know, access point, like, was suddenly didn't feel like it was serving me in the same way. And so, yeah, I mean, all the stuff I love to do in London was obviously closed, like everyone, and I think suddenly the feeling of like wanting to leave London became less of a whim and sort of more of a need. So yeah, once we were allowed to, I got, you know, basically for my birthday, day trips were allowed by this point, we hired a zip car and we drove down to Margate, and at that point, London was like plague city, and I was just so convinced that like the zip car was going to give away the fact that we were out of towners, and like someone was going to just like attack us or something. That's how crazy I felt. And we parked at the cliff top in Margate, and then we like ran down the cliff to go to Walpole Bay tidal pool. And it was just like, as soon as I got in the sea, I just felt this incredible relief and like this anxiety kind of just like washing off. And I would actually go as far as say it was actually a healing experience for me. I don't want to get too deep. But yeah, and I guess that's sort of where my day trip odyssey began. So then from then on, like each weekend, we would sort of start planning visits to go in as like a COVID secure way as we could. So yeah, I guess up until that point, like holidays for me had been, you know, little jaunts to Europe and getting like cheap flights, whatever. But these like little trips around London started to feel like holidays. Like they gave me that sort of freshness and new perspective and just made me feel very present. So yeah, even just like a shit deserted seaside town in the rain, you know, that's the kind of feeling I was getting. And at the time I was doing them all by car because of COVID. But all the places in the book are actually accessible by public transport and maybe a little taxi or bus at the end. I should give a shout out to my boyfriend at this point, who basically drove me to all of the places because I actually hate motorway driving. So so we were driving, so like during these trips, we got chased by cows, we had to fight our way through nettles to find the spots we were going to. We got stuck in like a field in the middle of a lightning storm. I mean, kind of all the things that you would just imagine on two city people who don't know anything about the countryside roaming around. And I guess at some point during this odyssey, I pitched the idea of a book about day trips near London to Hoxton Mini Press, as I felt like I really must not be the only one who was in need of these kind of escapes. Exactly. And I could also tell from my friend's interest in my trips that it just like wasn't just me, who was just sort of looking for actually like less obvious places to go that weren't very far from London. We went to al fresco galleries where we walked around fields and there was like massive surreal sculptures. We went to weird ornate gardens full of kind of like caves full of crystals. We had a lot of windy beach walks. We ate a lot of fish and chips. We ate in, seafood shacks and went to Michelin-starred pubs. Yeah, and wherever we were, we always tried to find a swim spot near. Dry road fans. Some of the places we went to weren't so nice. Sometimes the weather was really shit, and we'd just get there, go out the car, get soaked, get some chips, sit back in the car, drive home. There were like very many memorable moments on these. One of the most memorable trips was actually just after lockdown lifted. We were it was really nice weather, and we were looking for a beach that wasn't very far from London. And so we found one on the Isle of Sheppey. Has anyone been to the Isle of Sheppey here in Kent? Shout out to the Isle of Sheppey over there. No offense to the Isle of Sheppey, but so you drive over this kind of massive flyover to get there, and it's really industrial and not very inviting looking. And so we drove through Sheppey and we ended up on sort of this dirt track and to this beach that was right at the far end of the island. We thought, this is going to be super nice for like a really nice quiet dip. And then we got there and then we got out and there was like, it's a bit weird, something weird's happening. And then there was this massive sign that was just like, clothes optional beyond this point. So we basically driven all the way to go to a nudist beach. And there was like a weird vibe. There was these tents in the dunes and there was just like dudes would just sort of pop out of the tents naked and then sort of stand there and then like get back in. And then there was no one on the beach apart from like one guy who was running, wearing sunglasses, a bandana, and flip-flops, and then like that was it. And he was just like running up and down the beach, not very good arch support. I mean, yeah, so just like flapping about. And he was just there for the whole time we were there. And we just thought, oh, actually, we're probably intruding. So kind of just had a little quick run in the sea. One of us was clothed at the time. Clothing was optional. And it kind of felt like we'd stumbled into this sort of magical private club, which was like really brilliant and really hilarious. And actually that beach is just opposite Whitstable. So like all the people who are just like, supping oysters over in Whitstable are actually just like right opposite the water. There's just that dude just jogging naked. I think about him a lot. It was a real look. Yeah, so obviously that beach, Sally didn't make it into the book, but if you want to know where it is, come see me later. But yeah, actually we went back to Sheppey a few months later to go to Elmley Nature Reserve, which is actually really amazing, and it's a huge nature reserve, bit of wilderness with like amazing wildlife and birds and water, and there's these sort of luxurious little cabins and huts dotted all around, and they've got like outdoor baths and stuff, and actually we actually got engaged in one of those baths outside. So it just really goes to show that actually you sometimes need to visit a place more than once because, you don't really get the full picture. But yeah, so basically each of these trips... Hi. Not yet, I'm nearly done. Sorry. Am I boring? Do you want me to stop? Okay, well, I'm nearly done. I'll just rattle through the rest, yeah? Just way to make me feel like I'm really boring everyone in the... No, there will be a chance for questions, don't worry. But basically, yeah, so at some point during this time I actually got pregnant. And then not much changed in these day trips. It was more just like I couldn't eat all the delicious seafood. I had to lie down when it was hot during walks, and I just did a lot of wild wheeze. And so, yeah, and I was planning to visit everywhere before the baby deadline, but then she had other plans and came out a month early, so I was, basically she scuppered a lot of our day trip plans and my timeline for the book. But, so... After that, after the birth, we were all in quiet state. She was in hospital for a little bit. So once everything calmed down, the day trip started again. And actually we managed to, keep going. Obviously, they were a little bit different with the baby. Less sort of like carefree, just like, oh, let's just see where we go today. More like nap schedules, loads of crying in the car. Like staying in Airbnbs was less about like, let's go to a nice local pub, and more about like, let's sit in silence drinking wine after she goes to sleep in the corner of the room at like 7 p.m, which is, it's a vibe. But yeah, so, and somehow in this time I managed to finish the book and get it done. So yeah, and actually it was really amazing because I got to show our daughter lots of places and, dip her toes in the sea, which she actually hated. So yeah, when I say this book is my other baby, it really feels like it. And I guess it's quite a bold claim, but I feel like these day trips actually sort of fundamentally changed me as a person. Sort of people say that becoming a parent changes you, and it does. I'm exhausted all the time. But these day trips, yeah, writing this book did too. And I guess I'm still a long way off being an outdoorsy person. I actually just hate camping and hate a lot of things about leaving London. But instead of kind of wearing heels and lugging my handbag around, I now have a really well-stocked picnic bag and a picnic blanket, and I wear my mum's really ugly hiking boots that she's given me a hand-me-down. So yes, basically here I am. And I've got this book, and it's places that I've really loved visiting and that have given me a lot of enjoyment. And I really hope that the kind of people get that sort of refreshing feeling that I did. And I guess this is by no means a complete list of everywhere to go when you leave London. But and I am still a massive London snob at heart. So, but yeah, I mean, I still love London more than anywhere else. But as my mum used to say to me when I was dating, how can he miss you when you're sitting on his face? I don't actually think she meant it like that. But it works well for here. So yeah, the bit of space that I got from London just made me feel like my relationship with London was a lot stronger. You can all use that, by the way. My mum would like that. So yeah, actually these days I couldn't really live in London without leaving it. And it makes me appreciate it a lot more. And I guess considering everything in the book is just actually 2 hours away or less, I feel like I've come quite a long way. So now people can ask questions, yes.
Amazing. That was wonderful. Yeah, so who has a question for Sonia? It might be about where's the nudist beats, where's a good place to go, how can I lock my man down? That seemed to be some useful advice.
Dating advice also, I can do that.
Does anyone have a question for Sonia? Please, someone have one, otherwise I'm even worse for interrupting. You're going to pick who you want. There we go, right.
So as a fellow swimmer, where is the favourite place that you've swum?
Oh, I swim in a lot of good places, actually. Do you want a river? Do you want a lake? What do you want? Well, I swam in an amazing lake. There's a really nice hotel called Heckfield Place, which is actually in the book. And on site, they have a lake where you can just go and swim in the lake. And it was freezing, and it's super beautiful and peaceful. That was good because it felt very kind of like no one else was there. I did a lot of sort of random river swims near places. Some of those are in the book. Quite a few that you maybe know, like Portmeadow, Grantchester Meadows near Oxford and Cambridge. But yeah, I did a lot of sea swims also as well. So I'm now obviously drawn a blank on all those places where I went for sea swims. Just lots of nice beaches. Yes, but I would definitely recommend, if anyone wants a blowout weekend, going to Heckfield Place and swimming in there. Really nice, very, very cold lake.
Wonderful. On official behalf of Sunday Papers Live, if you like lake swimming, can I recommend the Wilderness Festival featuring Sunday Papers Live? Who else has a question for Sonia? Sonia, which question would you like next?
Where would you recommend a fellow London lover to go out of all the places you've been in your book? What's the number one place?
Depends what you like. So, obviously London, do you want food? Do you want art?
I guess something that's not London.
I mean, Margate is like London, but not London, which is quite a good place to go because you can go swimming, there's lots of nice restaurants, there's lots of nice art. I mean, there's sort of obviously not anywhere that's like London, but you can get a lot of good. I mean, for art and gigs and stuff, there's the Delaware Pavilion. Has anyone been there in Bexhill? There you go. You played there? When I was a child, I played violin in a concert there. There's someone famous down the front. She's played at. Yeah, so I would say sort of going along the south coast in Sussex and going to kind of a few. There's. Eastbourne, there's a really great gallery there. And with all those places, I've recommended places to eat as well, because obviously very important, getting good food out of London. Not always that easy.
Can I have a huge round of applause for Sonia Barber, please? Sorry to cut those questions off. The word came from on high. And a quick recommendation for all of you. If you want to travel somewhere that's not like London at all, can I recommend Derby, which is an absolute dump of the highest order. We're now going to have a short break while we refill all of our drinks, or rather, we pay people to refill all of our drinks. And then I'll be back with our next wonderful section editor. Just one small announcement. Sonia kept mentioning it's in the book. We have the book for sale, and we have Sonia here with the book, ready to sign the book. So if you'd like a copy of the book, they're on sale over here. Sonia is the person who looks like Sonia here. Put the two together, you might get a signed book. Can I have a huge round of applause for our wonderful, wonderful band? Applause, not planned, applause. There's so many words in my mind going round and crashing together in loads of different ways. We have a new winner for the largest dog competition. And I love the fact that our previous record holder for largest dog is immediately trying to have a staring competition with the new winner of largest dog. So we're going to crack on with our next section editor. Can I encourage you all to re-grab your seats? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. People at the bar, you just need to order quietly. That's the secret. Just be like, wine, please. And when they say how big, you go, very big. Marvellous. So our next section editor I'm going to introduce is our family editor. This is very exciting for me. I already mentioned that I have toddlers, so I now have the pressure of being a dad. And I want to tell you the number one rule of being a parent is this. When they have therapy in their 20s, they bring up the other parent first. That is the sole determinant that I'm going for to make sure that I'm doing okay. Is that at their first set of therapy, they come home and they're like, oh, it turns out I've just got a problem in my relationship with my mother. And at that point, I'll high-five them and be like, I did okay. So our next speaker is going to be talking about her life having had a complex paternal figure, are we going to say? Is that fair, a complex? So I'll be listening very carefully and taking down notes on what not to do, I think is where we're going. Yes, I'm getting a very big, that is exactly what you should do, Steve. You seem like you're at risk of being a terrible dad. We need to do all of this. So, lovely people, I'm going to introduce our family editor. And remember, when I introduce people, you have to clap and cheer so wildly that the bar staff have to say to the people at the bar, sorry, what was it you wanted? Not because of the volume, partly because of the volume, but also because it just wipes their mind, the enthusiasm that you've got. So, lovely people, are you ready to meet your family editor? So hold on. There might be a dogfight about to happen. Please clap, cheer, and go wild for Lily Dunn.
Hi everyone, I'm not Lily, this is Lily. I am talking to Lily today because we're going to talk about complicated parents and cults, just to kind of throw something else in. So I have written a book called The Last Days, which is out in July, about growing up in a cult. And Lily and I bonded because we both have the unusual situation of having parents who thought it was a really remarkable idea to join a cult. So that's what we're here to talk about. Lily's book is absolutely incredible. This book here, Sins of My Father. It's a brilliant book, and it is out on the 17th of March, but there are copies for sale over there should anybody want to buy it in advance and read it before all the press comes out. So yeah, Lily and I are just going to kick things off by having a little chat, really. And we are going to focus on her father, who was really, I suppose you would call him the errant parent in your kind of parenting situation. So you deal very beautifully with the father-daughter relationship in your book, and particularly a complicated one. So when you were young, your father left the family home to join the Sannyasin cult, and he went off to India. What do you think kind of prompted that decision that he made to kind of up sticks and go culturally?
Thank you, Ali. Just to give you a little bit of background, some of you may be aware of the sannyasin cult, which was around a lot in the 70s and 80s. The people, they were called sannyasins, who were the disciples, and they were renowned in North London particularly, but all over Europe and the world, for wearing the colours of the sunset, so oranges and reds and purples. There was a big drive, particularly in the 70s and 80s, with a sort of revived interest in Eastern religion. The Beatles obviously were also following their Maharishi or their guru. And my dad was one of these, what I might call the wandering tribe, who decided that normal life, mortgages, nuclear family was not really for him. And he wanted to experiment in transcendence and meditation, looking at alternative ways of being. I, like Sonia, was raised in Zone 1 in Islington, actually, ended up in Hackney, like Sonia also, but also worked at Time Out, so that's kind of weird. But, a little bit older than Sonia, so this was happening in the 70s. My dad joined the religious cult when I was 6. Came home from India, having disappeared for 6 months. He was still married to my mum, having disappeared for 6 months. Didn't tell us where he had gone, so we had no idea where he was. And he came back dressed in an Elise tracksuit. Yeah, I don't know if you know about Elise. It's still quite trendy. Purple with gaiters and sort of plastic patches on the elbows, and this mala, which was a necklace around his neck, which had a picture of his guru. But the shocking thing for me and my brother, I was 6 and my brother was 8, was that he told us that he had been reborn and that he was no longer our father. So we were slightly perplexed by this. And the book, This Is the Result, which is, 40 years or so of me kind of trying to work out why this man did this, is me really trying to work out what that was about for him. So yes, it was very much of its time, I suppose, that there was a culture around at that time, a rebellion against the post-war generation of their parents and mundanity, and trying, experimenting. But it was not a very comfortable world for those who were left behind, and also not very comfortable for those kids who got dragged along by their parents as well.
Because you speak quite a lot about that in the book, but your kind of position, I suppose, I don't want to say it was unique because it's very unusual, but you weren't quite inside the cult, but also you weren't quite outside the cult. And I kind of observed as I was reading the book that at times you are participating in your life and at times you're kind of stepping back and watching your life as well as you're writing the book. So how was it to kind of grow up with that sort of inside-outside perspective?
Yeah, I think looking back now, I see that I was very lucky in that I had a conventional life, and I had a mother who was very devoted to me and my brother, and acted her hardest to create a very sort of normal life for us. But at the time, of course, I loved my dad. My dad was incredibly charismatic. He was beautiful. He was tall. He was handsome. He was very sexy. One of the reasons that he joined this cult, which became known as the sex cult, was that it was all about free love and free sex. My dad was a philanderer in his marriage to my mum, regardless of the fact that he really loved her. And so he was pursuing something that he needed to have an outlet for that. But he was always also very charismatic. So I spent a lot of my childhood wanting to be around him. I wanted to be a sannyasin. I wanted to wear red and orange. I wanted to have a mala. I wanted to change my name. But actually, looking back now, I see I was incredibly lucky. But it was very confusing. So I would go and spend my weekends and my holidays with him in various communes and in his homes around the world. He was always moving. And then return to my sort of normal life and have to adapt to school and stuff, which was hard.
And you speak so much in the book as well, like you spend so much time trying to work your dad out. You're never sort of, you're never judgmental of him. You're never kind of acting as the person who's sort of saying, oh my God, he shouldn't have done this. You're really just telling us what he's doing. But you really examine where he came from as well, not just where you came from. So you examine his schooling. I was particularly interested in that he went to boarding school was he 8 when he was sent off?
He was 7. He was 7. So prep boarding school in the 1950s, as you probably probably can imagine, was not a nice environment at the age of 7. So he was left abandoned, felt very abandoned by that. And I think he told me that he never forgave his parents for leaving him on that step. So that kind of transition, the traumatic transition repeats itself in my book, of him being drawn to the community, the kind of institution, I suppose, which is what a cult can become. But also, you know, it was something that made him very unhappy. So I think there was a sense of a kind of lack of love for himself. So he was always looking elsewhere. He ended up an addict and died of alcoholism, which was very tragic, which again was another reason why I kind of felt I needed to try and answer or try and work out some of the questions around his life and his choices.
Which you do so beautifully, I think. But you also manage so well to inhabit your mother as well. So you're very much looking at your father, but also when we have these stories of cults, we tend to sort of focus on the people who go to the cult, and maybe in a way we sort of glorify them because it's something that's so out with our kind of everyday experience. But you very much focus on the impact that it has on the people who are left behind and your mother. So how was it to kind of go into that space as well?
Yeah, I'm a writer, and I've written since a very young age, and I was a novelist before I wrote this book. And my mum used to get really annoyed with me because I always focused on my dad, and she was just like, for God's sakes, he was never there. You know, he was the absent man. He did absolutely nothing, and yet you keep on sort of immortalizing him through your work. And actually, this book, there was a very important process in writing this book where I invited her into the process of I mean, I had to, because I was writing her story as well as his. And we spoke a lot about her history, about her past, about the good things as well as the bad things. And she was very much part of that. So what we have now, is very much, it's a homage to her as well for being such an amazing mother. She was a writer as well, and always, you know, she worked from home. And that was my memory of her, was that she was constant. So, yeah, she was amazing. But she never ever let her fear of the influence of this cult sort of get in the way of me and my brother developing our own relationship with our father, even though she really instinctively knew it was not a safe place for us. And it was not a safe place for us. I won't go into details here because we have children, but it was really not a safe place for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book deals so beautifully with kind of the inner mechanisms of what's happening and how much at risk you are. I think reading it as a parent was just completely mind-blowing to think that this was happening, and this was happening in the UK as well. I think we often think of sannyasins and kind of these sort of outlying cults as being in India or being somewhere else, but they brought it back here. So it was something that was very much. Now, you talk about being a kid and wanting to be one of the other children. Did that ever impact on your mom? Did you ever communicate that with her at the time?
I think as children we don't tend to communicate these things. I think we're so in the present moment, aren't we, that we just sort of we deal with it. I mean, she definitely knew of my longing to be more of a part of his life, but no, I think I probably didn't communicate with her, and I think her job was just to really kind of maintain that constancy of security of home.
And then, obviously, you've told your dad's story, and it's written down. You've told your mum's story as well. Your dad's dead. How does your mum find the fact that you've kind of gone and aired the family laundry? Yeah, well, that's always the challenge when you're writing memoirs, that you affect so many other people's lives. And I mean, as I say, I did invite her into the process of that, and so she feels that there's enough distance for her to be okay with that, although she's already getting feedback from some of her friends who have read proof copies and sort of like, how could you have tolerated this man? And I think it's like when you're actually sort of faced with your private life being read by other people, it's quite a challenging thing. But she's been really supportive of me doing this, and yeah, it's a complex thing when you write memoir, for sure. Yeah, and the book's very much, your mum wasn't kind of tolerating him for particularly long, but it's these far-reaching effects that people who are in other people's lives for a relatively short amount of time can have as well. Yeah. So I'm always fascinated, I think, because I've written memoir as well, by the kind of process that how do you go about piecing together a life and turning it into story as well, because it's one thing to have a life and it's another thing to make it engaging to the reader. So how did you go about that?
Well, it took me a long time to write, which I think really helps when it's a very personal subject matter. So one of the reasons I started writing this book was that I went through a separation, a divorce with my husband, and we loved each other very much, but I couldn't make it work, and I had to face the fact that I had unprocessed stuff that I had to deal with. So I felt quite compelled to write this out, and also my father had died very tragically of alcoholism. So it came out in bursts and sort of quite an urgency initially, and I got a lot of essays published, personal essays published of that material. And then I realized actually that there was a book. And so that process of sort of narrativizing my life definitely took a lot of drafts and getting feedback and people reading it for me to be able to objectify it. And yeah, that was hugely important, because I think you can be too close to your material as a memoirist, even as a fiction writer. So that distance, I think, has been really important. And also I did a lot of research. So this book is part of a PhD, and it has a lot of research in it about cults, about alcoholism, about addiction. So I was doing a lot of reading around my subject as well, and I think that also helps you to sort of distance yourself from it.
And almost kind of to contextualize it as well, that it's a story that fits within a particular cultural moment as well, I suppose, that people were looking for something else. Do you think that kind of cults still have the same pull that they once had, or do you think are we post-cult?
I think we are full of cults. I mean, particularly in America, aren't we? That, there's so much cultish behavior that still happens. It may be that we don't really recognize it as that, and it may be that we need to step outside of it to see it, because one of the determining factors of cults is that secrecy, it's the closed doors, it's that, you think that when you're in it, that's your reality. And actually, when you step out, you realize that this is a distortion of reality. It's not actually real and it's not healthy. So I think we are still very much in a culture of cults, maybe even more so in places like America. I mean, the cult of Trump is the perfect example.
I wonder if we've kind of almost mainstreamed cults, that they're sort of, it's acceptable, we've got them on our phone, we've got people following us, all this kind of cult language has just made its way into our vernacular that we use as well. Definitely. But it's been, obviously, it's not published yet, it's very close to publication, but you've had some brilliant responses to it so far. I know that Amy Liptrot, whose book is just out last week actually, said that she was completely obsessed with it. So how does it feel to take your story and then see that other people are kind of reading into it and taking it on as theirs?
It's hugely exciting, totally frightening and nerve-wracking, and I'm sort of feel like I'm on the precipice about to jump off the edge. But it's great. There's been a lot of real interest, a lot of really good reviews already from early readers, and it's amazing to be able to gift. It sort of feels like a sort of generous gift. You're sort of gifting part of your life. I mean, memoir is not your life; it's part of your life. You've created a story from it. You're gifting it to other people, to readers, to take what they want from it, and that. That's an amazing privilege. So I'm very excited to see how the general public kind of takes it.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably a really good point to kind of throw it open to the audience as well, if anyone has any questions.
If anyone has a question for Lily, do put your hand up. Lily, you have to point me at where you want me to go. Right back there.
I understand that your father died, but did you ever have any reconciliation with him about how he felt about his impact on you?
One of the main premises of this cult that he was involved with for like over 20 years, so most of his sort of prime of his adult life, was that you didn't take responsibility for anyone other than yourself. So children were seen as a hindrance. They were not seen as important in that they should be considered, and as dependents. So whenever I confronted him, and I confronted him many, many, many times, I had to, because he betrayed me in multiple ways, he always pushed it back on me. He always said that I could choose to feel happy or sad. It was my choice. So, to a 6 or 7-year-old, that was really traumatic and really difficult, because I had no choice. I had no control of my feelings. As he got older, he just became more and more deluded. So it became very difficult to penetrate that. And we kind of went along with it because it was the easier way to deal with it. And the book deals with that as well, because there were certain points when I felt like I could have intervened and I could have helped him, and perhaps I didn't, because we had set up this kind of landscape in our relationship. But yeah, so it was tricky. Thank you for that question.
Who else would like to ask Lily something? People online, sorry for the slight delays. It's me running to the question.
Hi, thank you. The book sounds absolutely fascinating. I actually lived in a sannyasin house in Highgate
Okay.
for about 6 years, but I was not sannyasin. So.
Okay, you know about
And there
it.
were a lot of young kids around in a lot of danger. Yeah.
Yes.
But I was wondering, when you pitched it to publishers, how did you do that? Did they not sort of say it's a bit niche? I mean, I can see that there are so many stories that lots of people can identify who have no interest in cults.
Yeah.
But were you not told that by
No,
publishers?
I wasn't. The book had lots of different iterations, so I lost an agent over it, so she said, I can't sell this. It's not just about the cult, it's really about my relationship with my father. And then I did more work on it after that happened, and I managed to land a brilliant agent, and then she sold it very quickly. But I think the key thing is I had written it very much as a literary project, so it's really sold on its quality above its content, and that's really important to me, because I don't want to just be identified as the writer of the cult. You know, I'm a writer, and it's about it's finding ways of articulating that to a wider audience. So no, I sold it. Once I had reworked it, I sold it very quickly, and there was a lot of interest in it. So, but that itself had to kind of be a process of distancing, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, there's another one there.
I like that the hands are always as far away from the last hand as possible.
Hi there. So we're interested to know who's influenced your view on spirituality, or if you're spiritual at all, or just sort of...
I've got a very, very high bullshit detector. I have very prominent antennae that stand up on my head at all times. So I am very wary of wishy-washy kind of, bullshit, basically. Cognitive, bypassing all this sort of awful stuff that particularly the sannyasins are absolutely brilliant at. Gaslighting. Oh my God, I spent most of my young years gaslighted, either by my father or the men that I fell for. So I would say I'm very wary of that. I'm quite pragmatic. But then I am philosophical, and I do believe that there is something other than just the environment that we're in. And I think I probably find that through my work. I think I find that through the way that I write, and non-fiction, and interrogating subjects. So I've certainly taken a lot from that, but much more in a kind of rigorous way, I'd say. Yeah, the PhD sort of, get it done properly. Yeah, there's someone here. Thank you.
I actually met Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh
back
in the day, very early, and it was very interesting watching him and as he started to gather a hold over people.
Yeah.
And I understand that's not what your book's about, but nevertheless. So it's quite interesting. And I wanted to know, how did you feel? Did you have a sense of satisfaction in the end when the whole thing collapsed in on itself?
No, not at all. And if you read my book, you'll see that I don't blame Bhagwan at all. I don't know now that I feel the same way, because there's been certain things that have come out or unearthed over the last year. I absolutely, and I really try to understand that pull. I really try to understand that magnetism, and I know he was highly charismatic. I know he had a huge power over these people. He was very clever. They did amazing things. Building this city. I don't know if anyone's seen Wild Wild Country. Building Rajneeshpuram. It's extraordinary what they did. And he also was very clever because he never got blamed. He pushed Sheila into the forefront so that she took the blame. And she was also a megalomaniac, so she should have taken the blame. So I think my view is that he was not equipped for how big it got. I think he was in control when he was in Pune, and I think the early days were idyllic, and I would have loved to have been there. But I think when it went to America, it got out of hand, and yeah. So I still sit on the fence with that.
It's got to be very, very quick.
Very quickly, I actually met him before Pune, and it was very interesting because I think you're exactly right, it got out of control. I met him in Mount Abu at some sort of meditation thing, and he was basically saying, don't worship me. I'm just channeling some of the information from people like Buddha and Jesus and blah, blah, blah. And all these people jumped up and down, went, Bhagwan.
Yeah. And then he got all into the bling, he got into the bling, and it all went a little bit downhill from there. But thank you.
Can I have a huge, massive round of applause for Lily Dunn?
And can I just say one thing?
Say away.
Ali Miller has got The Last Days coming out, which is about her experience of a child growing up in the Jehovah's Witness cult, and it's coming out in the summer, and it really is going to be a big book, so look out for that.
Fantastic. Huge round of applause for Ali Miller as well. Thank you for the great parenting tips. We're going to have a short break now while we get more of all of that delicious food and drink that is available here. If you're watching on YouTube, why not go to the kitchen? It's very nice there. Fantastic selection. And starting over in the corner, the You and Bleach Trio. We do have Lily's book for sale over in the corner. It's the book that's nearest Lily.
Thank you very much.
science session. Hello everybody, welcome back. Got some interlopers on my stage. Got a young MC in training taking over here. Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Oh, did you come to meet the giant dog that's so big I think it might be a polar bear? That's the general kind of size. Also, I'm very bad at identifying animals. For somebody with a degree in biology, I really ought to be better at identifying animals. Welcome back, everybody. Can I encourage you to retake your seats? If you're the proud owner of a seat, please take the bum that you also own and put it into the seat that you own. Because we need to crack on with our next section. Hello, internet people. I hope you enjoyed the kitchen. I hope there was something nice in your fridge. If there wasn't, send somebody out, because you can't miss any of this. Send somebody out to get something nice to put in your fridge that you can enjoy later. Or use an app. Those of you who live in London, I don't know if apps work anywhere else. Do you have phones in other places? Use an app, get some people. Great, I'm going to introduce our next section editor. Are we all with me? Are we all with me? Are we all with me? Dog number 1's with me. Dog number 2 is eating what appears to be a coconut cake. That is amazing. I didn't know that was dog food. Dog number 3 is with me. Dog number 4 is chilled out. Child number 1 is gone. Child number 2 is fine. I'm just checking on all of the important things. So, lovely people, are you ready? No, I need to introduce them. Our next editor. So what have we had so far? We've had You Can Go Swimming in the Sea. Our next editor has been swimming in the sea, so that's very exciting. Our next editor did not have a destructive dad who was part of a cult. Unfortunately, they're not bringing together all of the themes that we've had so far. But our next editor is a brilliant maker and doer and inventor and scientist and engineer and carpenter, and basically whenever I need anything fixed, this is the person that I turn to. And then I tell my kids, I did it. So she's our science editor. So lovely people, are you ready to meet our science editor? Hold on. It's good, but in the middle, there's a real island of lethargy. There's a lot of people who I think, you might be getting a 1 for effort, but you're getting an F for, no, 1 for achievement, F for effort. You're not really putting in the hard work. But I'll introduce her and you'll make it up to me by going crazy now. Please clap cheer, go absolutely wild for Anna Pojajski.
Hi, everyone. How are we doing? Very good, very good. I'm your science editor, apparently. I'm actually just going to tell you a bit of a story. That's my puppy. We've never tried this before. Just then was his first ever round of applause. He normally thinks people are clapping for him, but I don't think so this time. So I'm going to tell you a bit of a story, actually. This story starts in a town called Novosibirsk in western Siberia in the middle of winter in 1918. And George was a little boy. He was 7 years old, and he was with his family on a refugee train travelling through this town. And they were going east from Moscow. They were fleeing from the sort of uprising and the Russian Revolution at that time. And this journey was really stop and start. The train would, go through the countryside and then it would stop at every single town. And so it was very usual for them to be waiting for hours and hours and hours at stations as they went through. And so this was the case at this point. And it was the middle of winter, it was bitterly cold, and George had a baby sibling. And so it was his job to get off the train, go up to the front of the train, and as a steam train, there was hot water available. So he'd go up and he'd queue up for hot water for his family. So he hopped off, he went up to the front of the train, and to his dismay, there was a big, long queue of other people that had the same idea. So he tried at the cafe in the station. And George walked with a limp. Even though he was 7 years old, he'd contracted polio age 4, and so he always walked with a limp. So he limped across the station, went to the cafe, but they didn't have any hot water for them there either. But they suggested, why don't you go and try the restaurant on the other side of the town square? They'll probably have some. So George went, and he went to that restaurant, and he was given hot water. So he was feeling really smug with himself. He'd got this hot water. He started to make his way back to the train when he heard a whistle and some clanking and some kind of chug, chug, chug sounds. And as he got back to the station, he realised that the train was not where he had left it. The train was gone. So George was 7 years old, in the middle of Siberia, in the middle of winter, in the middle of the Russian Revolution. And what do you do in that situation? He didn't really know what to do. So he sat down next to some railings, had a bit of a cry, and went to sleep. And a few hours later, he was woken up, frozen stiff, by a friendly Polish soldier who took him into his house, and they sort of looked after him over the next few weeks. Now, eventually, that same family would join the easterly migration of refugees fleeing east from the revolution. And as luck would have it, George managed to find his family later down the track, because it was really just one route. So he managed to catch up with his family a year later, and they were reunited by Christmas the following year. The family went from there through China to Japan, and they settled in Tokyo for a little while. George did sort of primary school in Tokyo. And he eventually returned to Poland, age 11. Poland was his family country. And he eventually arrived there when he was 11. Now, George was my grandfather. And when I was a child, he was always this kind of big, sort of mysterious figure in our family. Whenever we went to visit him, he would talk about these kind of great and terrifying adventures. But I was always, as a child, kind of too shy to really ask more and get to know him as a person. And I found out at his funeral that he'd actually written a memoir. And many years later, I sat down and I read that memoir. And by this point in my life, I was an adult, and I've been studying materials science. Materials it's the study of stuff: metals, plastics, ceramics, glasses, that kind of stuff. And but as I was reading through Grandad George's memoir, one material kept coming up over and over again, and it was kind of intertwined with his story. And as a material scientist, obviously, that piqued my interest. And that material was plastic. So I was interested in, Grandad George's life story was pretty much the whole of the 20th century. And at that time, plastics, in his writing, were brilliant, amazing, fantastic, like a real symbol of modernity and like excitement about the future. But from my 21st century perspective reading this, today we've waged a war on plastic. It's the enemy. We vilify it so much. And so I was interested in that perspective shift between my granddad's kind of excitement and engineering and use of plastics, which I'll talk about in a sec, to our own now when we kind of say that plastic is the enemy. And so I guess this is the story, really, of Grandad George, but also the story of plastic. And they were born about the same time. George was born in October 1910. The first synthetic plastic, Bakelite, was invented in 1909 by a guy called Leo Baekeland in New York. And he was a chemist, and he was the first person to synthesize plastic in a laboratory. Before that point, we did have sort of naturally derived plastics, natural rubbers, shellac, tortoiseshell. These are all plastic materials that can be derived from nature, but Bakelite was like the first one where we'd made it in a lab, and it was kind of a man-made material. But for the next 10 years or so, Bakelite and other type of plastics, they were kind of chemical curiosity, but nothing really changed massively in society until the early 1920s. And three things really happened in the early 1920s that saw plastics suddenly become a mainstream material. The first of those was their recognition as a scientific family of materials, a new family of materials that we hadn't had before. It was by a guy called a German chemist called Hermann Staudinger, who did lots of experiments and basically realized that plastics were their own category of materials. When you make plastics, you take small molecules and you join them up together into long chains. And those long chain molecules are then bonded together. And this gives plastic, unlike metals and glasses, very distinct materials properties. They're often very lightweight. You can make them flexible. You can make them transparent. And this new category of materials was recognized scientifically at that point in the early 1920s. And then it generated a lot more scientific interest. So that was the first thing, scientific recognition of plastics. The second thing was the engineering of plastics. So people were starting to make machines that could industrialize the making of them and the processing of them so that plastics could then be kind of widely made into mainstream objects. The third change was marketing. So brands like Rolls-Royce, Siemens, Harrods of London, they all started making plastic objects and marketing them as amazing, new, sort of modern items that were really desirable. And so those three things really saw plastics start to come into the mainstream. Now, by the early 1920s, George himself was living his kind of teenage years in Warsaw, And by 1935, he'd applied to university, and he went to Warsaw Technical University to study aeronautical engineering. And at that time, the sorts of plastics that we had, PVC, polyethylene, polystyrene, and we had started to, as scientists, sort of study them more and really understand how they worked. So we categorized them into two different camps, really. The first are thermoplastics, which you can melt down and then reform as many times as you like. And the second type is thermosets, where you can't melt them down. In the 1930s, there was no talk about recycling, right? That all came in the 60s and much, much longer. So all of these interesting things about plastics were all just kind of scientifically interesting, and they weren't really thinking about recycling at the time. They were also derived from petroleum, right? They came from fossil fuels, but again, ideas about climate change and fossil fuels being bad didn't come from many, many decades yet. So plastics, as they were in the 1920s and 30s, were just an exciting, cool, new substance that was getting mainstream. And over the next few decades, scientists and chemists were basically playing chemistry Lego with plastics. It was a molecule that you could change the atoms of or add new bits to, make them longer, make them shorter, change how they bonded together. And all of this flexibility allowed for us to invent a whole array of new materials that we'd never really had before. This was kind of the wonder material that we'd all been waiting for. And as George was kind of living out his university years, he was obviously interested in materials. He was making stuff. He was studying aeronautics. When he was at uni, he designed and built his own glider out of wood and textiles. He made it with two of his friends, Ludwig and Jan, and they called it MIP SMIC. MIP was the acronym for each of their surnames, and SMIC apparently means brat, like little brat in Polish. But when George left university in September 1939, he was working as a sort of manager in a company that was making aeroplane parts. But in September 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. And so for the second time in George's life, he was made a refugee again. Over 3 days, over 3 nights, he walked from where he was in Warsaw to the Romanian border. He then got a lift to Bucharest and then Belgrade, took a train 600 miles to Athens. From there, all the Polish refugees were put on a boat to Marseille, and from there they were taken to Paris. And in Paris, George was sort of enlisted into the Polish army. He was made an ordinary soldier in the Polish army. And because he had this degree in designing aircraft, he became an aircraft designer. So he lived in Paris for a few months designing aircraft. And for him, actually, he was kind of having quite a good life there. He was earning money. He was working on what he wanted to be working on. But the same sort of good luck can't be said for his friends and his aircraft. So MIP SMIC was destroyed in an aircraft hangar fire, and his friend Ludwig, who had helped him make it, died. He was shot in prison in Warsaw, and his friend Jan died in Auschwitz. But George himself was fine in Paris for a while, but then in June 1940, the Germans invaded France as well. So again, it was time for George to move on. By this point, he'd been earning money. Him and his friend Stan bought motorbikes, and they were basically trying to get to British territory. From there, the Channel crossing was impossible, and so they decided to go south and try to get to Gibraltar instead. So they had these motorbikes. They took a few days sort of motorbiking south to Gibraltar, but when they got there, there was a military zone around Gibraltar, and they couldn't get through, but their visas were running out. So they really had no other choice but to get on a boat and go to the coast of North Africa. From there, they convinced a taxi driver to drive them 250 miles to Casablanca. And at that point, they really had nowhere else to go. But there were loads of boats in Casablanca at the time. Lots of merchant vessels, military as well, but lots of sort of vessels that were shipping goods around the world. And so, without any idea of where this boat was going, George got on the boat and hoped for the best. And by this point, he'd been traveling for a couple of weeks. He was basically only had the clothes that he had on his back. He had a couple of kind of papers. He had a packet of cigarettes. And that was it. The only luxury that he owned was an inflatable rubber lilo mattress, like a kind of inflatable bed, which he hired out to people on board in exchange for kind of food and money. So in that way, he was able to kind of survive on this very rough crossing out into the Atlantic Ocean. And this inflatable rubber lilo mattress would have been made of natural rubber. And we often hear about rationing happening in wartime. in kind of foodstuffs, but materials were also massively rationed in wartime because a lot of the valuable stuff like rubber and textiles and silk had to go to the military. So civilians were kind of quite short on materials. And as well as that, materials that came from abroad, things like natural rubber, that comes from rubber trees in the tropics, right? And so things like that, things like silk that comes from Japan, in wartime, all of those supplies were cut off. And so something like a rubber mattress owned by a civilian would have been incredibly valuable to him. So he held onto it and he hired it out during the day, and therefore he was able to survive on this boat. A couple of weeks later, they landed in Nova Scotia in Canada. And some people got off there. Other people stayed on the boat. George stayed on the boat, came back across the Atlantic again, and landed in Cardiff docks in September 1940. So a full year after he'd left Poland, he landed in Cardiff docks. From there, he went to London and started living in Brixton, working as an aircraft designer again, and then moved to Gloucester. And in Gloucester, he was working as an aircraft designer, designing new aircraft for the military. And the local English teachers were also giving English lessons to sort of local refugees that had come. And one of the teacher's daughters, George took a particular shine to, and in fact they got married and then moved back to London during the war. But when the war ended, George's job ended too. They didn't need new fighter jets particularly anymore. So he was living in London. He'd always planned to go back to Poland, but actually Poland still wasn't safe, even in 1945, and thereafter it wasn't safe to go back to. So he was sort of stuck in London. His job had ended. He didn't really know what to do. So resident in this weird, strange, new country, he turned to a weird, strange, new material, which was plastics, and started a plastics company with his Polish friend, making kind of household objects out of plastic. They sort of used their engineering minds to be able to make this company. It did pretty well. They kind of expanded it. They moved it to Croydon. But they needed a name for it. And George's surname was Pajajski. His friend's surname was Mikulkiewicz. And they sort of looked at each other and they thought, I don't think this is going to be a very snappy title for these Brits. So they called it Stewart Plastics. Their employee, Harry Stewart, was the guy that kind of scrubbed the floors. But they named it after him because it was an easier sounding name. So in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, this was when loads of new plastics were being developed. You know, they were really taking off now. Polyethylene terephthalate, the stuff that we make drinks bottles out of, polypropylene, nylon, all that stuff kind of happened during the war and then after as well. And as George lived out his middle age in kind of London's leafy suburbs, the whole material landscape was starting to shift in a big, big way. Things that were previously made out of paper and wood and textiles were now increasingly being made out of polyethylene, polypropylene, nylon, elastane, sort of synthetic plastics. In the 1960s, we started to be a bit aware of all of this stuff. We started to look at landfills and think, there's a lot of stuff in there. We started to look at the environment and think, there's a lot of plastic floating around here. But at that time, the blame was shifted to the consumer, actually. So don't be a litterbug was kind of the primary thing. You know, there's plastic in the environment because you're all littering and not putting your litter in the bin. The big companies, the corporations, the industrial guys took no responsibility for that. It was all put on the consumer. I mean, it actually took until the 1990s for the consumer to really, well, for local councils to get into kind of large-scale plastics and other materials recycling. It took a long, long time for us to actually see that problem of landfill and do anything about it at a large political level. George himself retired in 1987, aged nearly 80. He worked as an aircraft designer after Stewart Plastics for the rest of his career. And in that time, of course, he'd seen even aircraft change into plastics as well, from his MIP SMIC machine that was wood and textiles. We then made aircraft out of aluminium, and now we make most of our aircraft out of reinforced plastic composites. And by the time George was at the end of his life in the early 2000s, everything around him had transformed into plastic. The clothes that he was wearing, the carpets, the TV, the windows, everything was made of plastic. And when he died in 2007, having lived through both world wars, it wouldn't be long for us to wage another war, not on each other this time, but actually on those plastic materials. I hold David Attenborough solely responsible for that. And it was funny, though, because having studied material science in the early 2010s, when we studied plastics, there was no mention of plastic waste at all. When David Attenborough did his Blue Planet 2 program, that was when suddenly, in the public consciousness, plastics was a problem. And suddenly people were talking to me about my job, which is nice. But the war on plastic is a contentious issue, right? We all feel strongly about plastics. Personally, as a material scientist, I love plastics. I think they're amazing. And you don't need me to tell you that we couldn't live our modern lives without them, right? So there's a few things that we have proposed. The first is, why don't we just make our plastic stuff out of other stuff? Well, none of the replacement materials would be as good or as cheap or as transparent or as lightweight as plastics are. Why don't we make them biodegradable? Well, biodegradable plastics, remember those long molecules I was talking about? When they biodegrade, bacteria just chop those long molecules into shorter molecules. Shorter molecules are liquids or kind of more powdery plastics. That makes microplastics, which gets into your environment and into the oceans and eventually into our bodies. So biodegradable plastics are a real false friend in our kind of desire to help the environment. And so the problem really is bigger. It's all about our behavior. It's about our expectations for materials. And in order to change how we are damaging the environment through plastics, we need to change ourselves. There's no point in changing the materials. We don't need to. They're great. We need to change ourselves and our expectations and our behaviors around how we use plastics. And, you know, George, as a designer, I think would have been well on board with that. Let's redesign our stuff. Let's change how we use it rather than just changing the materials themselves. So I'm going to stop there. That is a story, one of the stories in my book. There's 10 other stories about materials and our lives and society and makers as well. It's called Handmade. You can get it at the front. But for now, I've been Anna Pojajski. Thank you very much.
Big round of applause for Anna Pojajski, please. Go this way. If you'd like to ask Anna any questions, she's the one that looks like Anna, and she'll be in this room. If you're online and you want to ask Anna questions, just go to annapojajski.com. You all know how to spell Pojajski straight away, just from hearing the sound of it. We're now going to have 20 minutes to order giant sausage rolls and sandwiches and all the glorious things that they have here. If you're at home, why not have a nice, big, comfortable poo? See you in 20 minutes.
Other news is stuck.
Very cool. You learn, just remember the weird thing about it, it goes straight from E flat to the tap in the stage back. Anyone saw that bass thing? Yeah, it's the weirdest thing, and it stays on that long than you think before it goes straight to G. second time goes to catch something else. No, F is D then B. Not space back break.
Right here, you. It's long.
Can I have a huge round of applause for the You and Bleach trio? Marvellous, marvellous, marvellous work. Now, we're about to move on to our UK news section, and I want to tell you a little thing about running an event like Sunday Papers Live. First thing, I don't run Sunday Papers Live. I am merely the monkey, not the organ grinder. I sit on top of the piano dancing. Sometimes you book a speaker because you think the stuff this speaker knows about is kind of relevant to all the stuff that's going on. And then news happens and you realise you've got the perfect speaker for everything that is going on. So our next speaker is the editor of Open Democracy, the writer of a book called Democracy for Sale, and other than a large number of lawyers, PR agents and bankers, is London's leading expert on dirty Russian money in British politics. So, lovely people, are you ready to meet our incredible politics editor? Would you please clap, cheer, go wild, welcome to the stage, Peter Gagan. So this is very exciting for me because I get to sit on the chaise longue because all the cameras point at the armchair. So I'm just going to lounge here and I'm going to be interviewing Peter. Peter, how are you finding Sunday Papers Live so far?
I'm trying to figure out how to turn this on.
Oh, you don't need to. It's all done. Ed,
Oh.
the sound engineer, is amazing. He does all that. You just need to talk.
Oh, it's all done for me. Oh, wow.
Yeah. He's
never
really good. He's like a professional and everything.
This is incredible. Wow. And I don't think I've ever been called the perfect anything. And I don't think I've ever been like a kind of wrestling style entrance either. So thank you very much for this.
It's a whole experience, Sunday Papers Live. Now, Peter, right. So, I want to know, quick summary, what have you been saying for ages and suddenly everybody is really listening?
I don't know if they're really listening, but I've definitely been saying it for ages. I was really struck the other day, Robert Peston, the kind of excitable ITV news anchor, used to be at the BBC, sent this tweet going, as Warren Buffett used to say, the investor, when the tie goes in, you can see who's got no trousers on. And he was talking about Russian money in politics. He was saying, we can now see all these different people had money from, Russian donors, people linked to Putin and all the rest of it. And I was going, we didn't need to wait for the tide to go in to see that. This has been obvious for ages and ages and ages. And, it's, as somebody who started off, I started off writing about this stuff about 5 years ago. Just in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, actually. And I started writing about the role of money in British politics because I was kind of interested. I was like, this is kind of curious. Like, who funds all these British political campaigns? And when I started looking at it, I was like, this is, it's not as big a deal as in America because there isn't as much money. Like in America, the last American presidential election cost something like $5 billion. Huge amounts of money. In Britain, $5,000 will buy you a dinner with Michael Gove if you want it. You could choose to keep your money too. But I started off looking at going, well, it can't be that big a deal because it's just not that much money involved. You're talking about £50,000 will get you into a thing called the Leaders Group of Conservative Donors, which means that once every quarter you get to meet all the Prime Minister and leading cabinet ministers for an off-the-record briefing, chat, dinner, what's discussed, nobody knows, £50,000.
We might have a member here. This is quite a well-off audience. We got any
I wouldn't
members
be
of the
surprised.
Leaders Group here? No, at Wilderness there would definitely be at least two here. Sorry.
If there is, please put your hand up. But I started thinking, well, can't be that important. But then as I started doing more and more digging and looking more and more into it, I discovered, actually, this is really bad because it's really cheap. So you can buy huge amounts of access. As we've seen now, since Boris Johnson became the Prime Minister, almost £2 million have come from people who are born in Russia, people with links to the Putin regime, right into the coffers of the Conservative Party. So unfortunately, Mr. Peston, it might look like that to him, but actually to some others like myself who've been writing about this for a while, and my colleagues at Open Democracy and elsewhere, we've kind of known about this for quite a while.
Did you just tweet back to Peston to tell him how long the book's been out?
I should have sent him a little copy of it.
And just, are there any particularly shocking examples, things that like you've been saying, look at this one. I know that all of the rest might seem like it's too much but look at this. This is the...
It feels like this every day right now, though. Like, look at the front page of the Sunday Times today. Evgeny Lebedev, the owner of the Evening Standard, he was made a peer. He is a legislator for life. I think Britain's mad, by the way. I think it's a really mad country. And it's like, so what? You just make your mates legislators for life? This is crazy. So he's a legislator for life. Initially, he wanted to be called, I think it was Baron of Moscow. And they said, no, you can't be that. So he's the Baron of Siberia and Hampton. And it turns out he had been the kind of services, the intelligence service said, look, we shouldn't give him a peerage because of his connections with the FSB, the ex-KGB. And it looks like Boris Johnson rolled roughshod over them and badged him to giving him a peerage. Quite why, we don't know. There's a couple of things we do know about him. One is that Boris Johnson's attended many interesting parties at Lebedev's villa in Umbria over the years. We know that he's very, very well connected. He's connected both here in London and also in Russia. And we also know that he's not actually particularly fond of appearing in the House of Lords. He's been 3 times, and I think he's never said a word.
You get 300 quid each time you turn up, though, don't you?
Evidently, he doesn't need it.
So what I'm going to do is, rather than me interview Peter, I'm going to throw this open to all of you to ask questions to Peter about anything you would like to know about this whole area of the influence of money on British politics, how it connects to all the other stuff that's going on. And Peter's going to choose who he wants to talk to, and I'm going to run. And then if you run out of questions, I'll ask one. So who would like to ask Peter a question?
There's one gentleman there, I see.
I'm running. Online people, hello.
Thank you. Is he called Lebedev? I don't know his name.
Yeah, Evgeny Lebedev.
Okay, so he worked for Lord Rothermere. Right, Lord Rothermere, hereditary lord. What do you see as the difference between Lebedev's influence and Rothermere's influence, and why is one worse than the other?
I think there's a really interesting question more generally about influence in Britain and how influence is bought. Because you're talking about, again, the House of Lords. You're talking about people who are, in one instance, hereditary, so it's passed down, or people who are made lords because of their connections. And I think it's, in some ways, it's the whole gamut of it. How easily influenced British politicians are by people like both the Rothermeres and the Lebedevs of this world. You can see it. You can see whether it comes from media organisations and coverage they get. But also, we saw it with David Cameron and Lex Greensill, the Australian banker, that David Cameron was lobbying all of his former friends. And money is a huge part of this. Politicians have a huge interest. There's 2 big problems with this. One is that British politics runs on private money. So the Conservatives in the last general election raised about £50 million from private sources. So the Conservatives in particular are very, very reliant on private money to fund the political parties. That's how you end up in situations where, like Richard Desmond, a Tory donor, ends up sitting next to the Housing Minister, Robert Jenrick, at a Tory fundraiser in which, just afterwards, Robert Jenrick reverses a planning decision and saves Richard Desmond £50 million. That's very cheap. It cost Richard Desmond £8,000 to buy that seat. So that's one part of it. It's that political parties run on private money. The other side of it is we have a huge revolving door between business and politics for when politicians leave office. And that's where the real money is made. You don't make your money. Boris Johnson took a pay cut to become the Prime Minister. And that is true, he really did. But he'll make it a lot more when he stops being the Prime Minister. You go on to the boards of companies, you get paid 6 figures to do absolutely nothing. And that's where the really pernicious influence in some ways are. Because if you're in that situation, are you going to make decisions that you know down the line are going to make your easy life afterwards more difficult? Probably not.
Just to follow up on that one. So if it's so cheap to buy British politicians, why is Russia that interested in buying us compared to all the other places they could buy?
I think in Britain, when it comes to Russian money, it's not necessarily the political system or just the political system that's compromised by this. It's the entire City of London architecture that's about washing dirty money. So there's a huge, basically Britain is a giant secrecy jurisdiction. So if you can set up companies in Britain, in 15 minutes, you could do it on your phone, that are based in other places where you can hide, shell companies, you can hide the identity of who these people are. Once you do that, you can give money to British politics, which is insane. So a shell company can contribute to a British political party. All it has to have is some sort of foothold in Britain, which is the shell companies. But you can be based in the BVI, the British Virgin Islands, Gibraltar, the Isle of Man, Jersey, all of these secrecy donations. So that's a big, huge part of it, the secrecy. The other side of it too, actually, is Britain's oddly reputation for probity. So I've done loads of work about how Eastern European, basically gangsters, use British corporate vehicles, things called like the Scottish Limited Partnerships. It's all a bit jargony, but basically these are corporate vehicles that allow you to hide the identity of who owns them. And the reason they actually use these is partly because of the mechanics of these vehicles, the specifics of them, but it's also because they're based in Britain. And in places around the world, this is seen as a mark. It's like a kite mark. So if you can go on, way before the conflict, but you could go on to Ukrainian website and you'll find people selling Scottish Limited Partnerships, Northern Irish Limited Partnerships, with a little Union Jack flag showing this is a great thing, guys. This should get into it. So that's a big part of it. And the other part of it is also the attraction of London as well as a place. London is an attractive place for people who've taken huge amounts of money out of, mainly former Soviet bloc countries, but not exclusively. People who've expropriated huge amounts of wealth from their countries. They can sink it in London. London housing is very, very, it hasn't gone down in a very long time. I'm sure you're all aware. It's got schools, it speaks the English language, it's well connected, it's a nice place to live. So all of that stuff together makes London the perfect place. And it's welcomed it. From the mid-90s on, we have welcomed this. Just last week, finally the government closed these things called golden visas. So basically, if you gave £2 million, if you said you're going to invest £2 million in Britain, you could get a visa. And these are where all these people have got visas, loads of them. Over 2,000 went to Russian millionaires alone. So we created an architecture that invited this in. And people have said this for so long. Oliver Bullow's new book is great. His previous book, Moneyland, the writer Oliver Bullow, he wrote a best-selling book about this just 5 years ago. This is not, this has been known for so long. And that's why it's kind of galling to watch British politicians in the last week stand up and go, something must be done about this. But you've had so many chances to do something about this, and you really haven't wanted to for all manner of reasons.
Fantastic. Now you've got to pick where you would like me to go for your next question.
I'm going to choose this lady down here because she's in my eye line.
It's as good a reason as any. Here we go.
Thank you. Mine is a two-parter, but I'll keep them brief. I wondered if you could give us, because there's lots of brilliant examples of the influence I think we're all aware of that occurs, but I wondered if you could give us examples of not just on a council planning level, but the legislative effects that has, and then some discussion around some of the reforms you think would be effective.
Yeah, I think that's what's really interesting is exactly that, is how influence happens in politics. And sometimes it can be down to the level of councils. So in that instance I mentioned about Richard Desmond, that was Tower Hamlets Council. And what was happening was Tower Hamlets was bringing new legislation around social housing. And he was building a huge, big development in the Isle of Dogs. And effectively that was going to put a huge tax on this new expensive development because they were going to have to pay in lieu of social housing effectively. And because basically we have such a weak local government system in the United Kingdom. It's such a centralised state. And ironically, all the devolved regions are just as centralised. Scotland is very centralised, Northern Ireland is centralised, and so is Wales. And it means actually everything can be overridden on a ministerial level for basically everything. So what happens in those instances, and we see it time and again, and it's actually, the local level is often where the most influence can be bought because it's, and it's also very lucrative. And you can then see how planning decisions are changed and how things that were supposed to happen don't happen. And we've seen it, I've done so many stories about this over the years where you can see the influence of lobbying from vested interests, frankly. The access, we saw this, the Owen Paterson scandal, which in many ways has got us to where we are now, was somebody who was, former Northern Ireland minister, and I'm not libeling by saying the worst Northern Ireland minister ever, which is really hard. I used to cover Northern Irish politics, and Owen Paterson was famously awful. Then he went to the Department of Farming and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. The minute he left, because I wrote a story about this, he starts ringing around people he'd met as a minister asking, can I do consultancy for you? Because I know someone. He rang. And this guy in Northern Ireland was chatting to me. He goes, he said, Peter, what does he know about? What's he going to consult on? And then he ends up signing 2 huge consultancy contracts worth way more than his MP's salary for 2 companies. One is Randox, who you probably all heard of now because they do all that testing on diagnostics. And the other was Lynn Country Meats. The connection between this, what expertise is this guy selling? And then he got paid about, that's about £115,000 a year by these two companies combined. And of course, you're going to call in your pound of flesh eventually. And the pandemic hits, and these companies are, especially Randox, he's lobbying ministers on behalf of them. They get these huge contracts. I also wrote a lot about PPE and all those contracts. And these companies get huge contracts. There's huge amounts of money involved. In terms of what can be done, there's actually loads of stuff you could do pretty easily. You could bring in new anti-revolving door legislation, say, so at the moment, you've only got, after 2 years, you don't have to say, you can do whatever you want, basically, once you leave office. So, for example, David Cameron, exactly 2 years and 1 month after leaving as Prime Minister, starts becoming a lobbyist with Lex Greensill Capital. And because his own lobbying reforms were so bad, David Cameron's lobbying reforms, he doesn't even have to be listed as a lobbyist because he's an in-house lobbyist, and that doesn't qualify. So it's not hard in some ways. And the same with shell companies. Tomorrow you could bring in legislation that would stop, that would mean that shell companies no longer had legal person in Britain, and that you had to declare the beneficial owner. The fact that we don't means actually all this talk about sanctions and targeting Russian money in Britain is kind of impossible and irrelevant because you don't know where it is. I haven't a clue. It's really impossible to find out where it is because it's gone through secrecy jurisdictions. We can't see it. And so there's a question, why do really rich people who run this country not want to do this? Who knows?
Does anyone have the answer for no? We'll take the next question for Peter. Peter, you can choose anyone you want. Who would like to ask Peter?
I see this man over here has got a question too. Luckily for you, there's not loads of people down the back.
Don't pick the one I'm
questions.
right next to. Pick the one who's mine.
Thanks. So, following immediately from your most recent observation, what hope is there for any serious reform of, for example, shell companies and of all these other very simple things that you say can be done? I mean, it doesn't look as though Keir Starmer's Labour is of the stamp, of the ideological stamp that would do anything about it. Would Corbyn's Labour have done? I mean, that did seem like, for all its faults, a real opportunity to clean up these sorts of things. What possible hope is there for change, and what possible hope is there for a popular movement for change in these areas?
I think in some ways, ironically, now is actually a really good time. Because there is, I know it sounds hard to imagine, but if you think about, pointing out the hypocrisies of this stuff, like having, say, Boris Johnson on the one hand making great statements about we're going to sanction everybody and then seeing him next to Yevgeny Lebedev, there does seem, at least on some level, to be a potential now, I think at least, for some change on some of this. Some of this might never happen, but there is actual change, like things like shell companies, that would have make a huge difference, make a huge difference on things like fraud that actually could be done. But there's a deeper problem though, I think, and it still comes back to that role of money in politics and that whole system that we're talking about, where you have people who get into, it's a bit like, it's a kind of inverse Groucho Marx thing. Anybody who should get into politics, who wants to get into politics, probably shouldn't. The very fact that you want to probably should disabuse you from doing it. But what you've got is a system where it's in everyone's interest at the moment, at least politically, and all the main political parties still, to keep the system up, because they all actually want to raise money. One of the first things Keir Starmer did when he became leader was set up a kind, I think they call it the Labour Circle or something, a funding group to try and get money in the door. And I understand why you do it, because you need to pay your staff, you need to do this, but that's a huge part of it. Becomes a vicious cycle then. Everyone's trying to get money. No one really wants to ask too many questions about the system because they've all got an interest in it.
Do we have any Chelsea fans in, by the way?
I could see a hand down the back. I don't think it's just a Chelsea fan.
No,
I'm not,
it's a question, not a Chelsea. No Chelsea. No one would admit to being a Chelsea fan.
Thanks very much.
Controversial.
Thanks. I sort of have very little, say, focus or interest in politics, but I think what you're describing is amazing. I suppose it's the framework that would mean that you would term this as something that happens, although it's not acceptable, but in other parts of the world, this is termed corruption because it doesn't sit within a legal framework. And that's probably the biggest hypocrisy.
I think that's a huge part of it. We saw that with the PPE stuff. I found the language around that so frustrating. Chumocracy? Just to wind that back, that was describing the fact that if you were what was called a politically connected firm, you were put into a VIP lane to bid for contracts, you were 10 times more likely to get a government contract. If that happened elsewhere, especially if it happened in the global south, we would call that corruption in a heartbeat. But instead we come out with these, chumocracy as these kind of like, oh, it's all just a bunch of old boys. I do think there's something about British exceptionalism in all this, that it couldn't possibly happen like that here. And I grew up in a country like surrounded by, I wrote about it in my book, it was a culture of brown envelopes that I grew, in the world I grew up in. I always remember there was a big planning scandal in Ireland, and I remember as a kid saying to my mum, do you think that guy, the minister, do you think he's guilty? And my mum was like, oh, your grandfather, when he had that farmland, he gave him a few quid to change it. So it was part and parcel kind of life, but we also called it corruption, and I think Ireland probably did a much better job of getting rid of it. Whereas in Britain, exactly that, it's kind of, it's an old boys network, or it's the schools or whatever else, but actually, fundamentally, a lot of this stuff is some stuff that people should be prosecuted for, and politicians should be prosecuted for, frankly. Like, this should not be something that is kind of, oh, it's just one of those things that happens. It should be something that's absolutely really not something that happens. And it's so corrosive as well. I think it corrodes trust in democracy and democratic institutions, the more we allow this to go on, and without calling it corruption, without coming up with all these, kind of fake words to describe it.
Fantastic. Who would you like to talk to next?
There's a lady there, and there's another one over here too.
I think, I'm not sure, but this kind of leads on from the language that's surrounded. How complicit do you see the British media as being in all of this?
I think it's interesting as somebody who has been writing about this stuff for years. And I remember when I first started writing about all this, a really good friend of mine who's at the BBC was like, why are you interested in all this stuff? You're interested in, it's all stuff that's already happened. Like the Brexit referendum happened. Like, who cares who funded it now? It's over. And I was like, well, it doesn't really work like that. I think that's not a great premise for I don't think that's the best kind of, it wouldn't be the lens I would take to think about how to understand the world. I think the media has generally been quite slow to cotton on to a lot of these sort of things. I think latterly have become better. Have done more stories about it, but I still think there's a reluctance to think about it structurally. There's a reluctance to think about it like it's kind of just, well, that's an individual. It's a bad individual who's done something bad, and that's another bad individual who's done something bad. Whereas I think there's a need to pull the lens back and go, actually, what's really going on here? Like, what are the structures that are incentivizing people like this? What's the deeper? There's a much deeper malaise. Whereas I think there's a tendency just to report these things as a series of almost unrelated scandals that happen, and then especially the news cycle. I think the speeded up news cycle in the kind of post TV news age means that they kind of run into each other but aren't seen as connected to each other properly as well. So I think I've got a lot of friends who I think do a lot of good work in this area, but I think there's a lot more the media could have done and should have been able to do over the last few years to cover these issues more. I think there's been a lack of interest in them historically. It's changed a bit in the last 6 months, but I think before that it really did feel at times like I was there's a few of us banging a drum, but really, really not enough. And you can see it now, the stuff that's in the front page of the newspapers at the moment, I am going, is that a story? I knew that for you. I wrote about that. Wow. And it's kind of all been re-dug up and reported as if this is all shockingly new. Oh my God, oligarchs sue journalists in courts in London and they stopped them publishing. Who knew? It's like, well, if you went down to court most days of the week, you'd find out. And if you talk to people, I know tons of people that's happened to. So I think there's been a kind of sense where it's seen as exceptional and different and not quote unquote newsworthy. And I think it should have been seen as newsworthy.
Fantastic. Who'd like to ask Peter?
Thank you. So following off that, what are the 3 things that you think we could all do to change that? Because you're obviously very informed, very passionate about it. So what can we all do to change that? And then secondly, sorry, I give you.
Oh no, you're
like,
fine. You're
like,
fine.
Oh, yes,
no.
Here I go.
Oh no, I wasn't. I was like, oh, this is always the toughest question. It's a good question, the toughest question.
It's great. It's always good to talk about the reality, but what do we do? That's the really big question. And then secondly, my question would be, what would be your CV requirements for members of Parliament?
Oh, that's a very good question too. You get the best question prize. If I had some books, I'd give you them too. It's a very, very good question. I do think, like, I might be slightly naive in thinking this, but I do think there is, like there's a role in people making politicians aware that they care about this stuff. So at Open Democracy, where I'm the editor, we set up this little kind of tool that lets people write to their MPs. We don't tell them what to say, but if there's something that happens that we think they might care about, we can email our readers. If you subscribe to Open Democracy, or even if you don't, even if you just get our weekly emails, which I will suggest that you all do. You can write to your MPs. And when the Owen Paterson scandal broke, we said, look, we want to strengthen Parliament. We want to strengthen the rules. And 5,000, I think there's 6,000 of our readers wrote to their MPs. Every single MP got at least one email from an Open Democracy reader. And that might seem like not a big thing, but it's interesting. I was talking to some MPs afterwards who raised it and mentioned it to me because like, I'd never got any emails about this ever before. I was like, and they were like, oh God, this is... Like, I hadn't realised that people might care about this. They might care about things like parliamentary standards. And I do think there is there is opportunities there. People, like, frankly, most MPs get letters from the same 10 different people, who just send them the same 10 letters over and over. I think making politicians aware that this is an issue that people actually care about is definitely part of it. And voting in line with that as well, frankly, not rewarding politicians and parties that are feeding this sort of system, I think is a huge part of it. It was one of the reasons I was really heartened to see some of the by-election results, especially the Owen Paterson by-election, where it did feel like actually, this felt like almost an anti-corruption vote. And I think that's really important. And I think there's a kind of there's a wider piece of civic engagement around all of this too. And not seeing this, I think, collectively trying to think about what does democracy look like beyond the way it works now, which doesn't really work very well. A really good friend of mine, Paul Evans, wrote a fascinating book called Save Democracy, Abolish Voting. And it's kind of a kind of Swiftian kind of provocation, really. I don't think he really thinks we should abolish voting, but he's kind of arguing, if this is what we're reduced to just once every 4 years, putting a cross in a box, is that enough? Is that actually going to incentivize change? So I think there's a job of all that too. I think that's a big part of it. I think in terms of CVs and politicians, I think, the system that we currently have for aged, it seems I've never been politically involved with political parties, but I'm really struck when I talk to politicians how many of them, joined the party politics in university, then went and worked as a SPAD, and then maybe went into the private sector for a couple of years, then go back, get a job as a local MP. This is not good, guys. This is not a really great way of creating a system that's going to work. And I think that's part of it. But the other thing I would almost make a case for is I do think the voting system in this country is so iniquitous, and I think that's a huge part of it too. And I think that contributes to how you end up with the politicians that we have. We have this system, the first past the post system, where really the job of work of what you have to do, instead of trying to be well-rounded, what you have to do is basically convince the people who would go to a local parliamentary branch that you're the man for them or the woman for them, who are really the people in the world who should least be choosing who our MPs are. And that's especially how you end up with some of our backbench Tory MPs, who you do look at and go, where did you come from? And I think that's how they got there. So I think changing that system will be part of it.
And let's not forget the front bench. Well.
Indeed.
Who else would like to ask Peter a question? Peter, there's a very keen hand back
I see that there. Sorry, yes.
I'm just drawing on the comment about $5 billion spent on the US election. We all hear about PACs and super PACs. And then coming back to the question about corruption, who gets it right? Where is there in our so-called democratic world that gets it right?
It's a very good question, actually. I think it's interesting. I think, a lot of there's quite a few Northern European states. They've different systems. They definitely. It's really interesting looking at what a political scandal looks like in other countries. So the Norwegian government basically had to resign en masse a while ago, or like a load of them. I think the Prime Minister went as well, because they were claiming rent on houses that were like, I think like 50 kilometers from Oslo rather than 60 or something. And I was looking at it going like, this wouldn't even make the papers in the UK. Like this wouldn't get near it. In the same way that like you see scandals in German politics and French politics about what are frankly tiny sums of money for British politics. You know, a party got 10,000 euros from some sort of dodgy think tank. You're like, you know, and people are resigning en masse. Whereas here, like again, that would barely scratch the surface. One of the things I think Central European countries or Northern European countries do quite well that is seen as anathema here is state funding for political parties. I do think that's a big part of the problem here. It's not, you know, there's ways in which you could do it. So like the argument against it is that you end up with a kind of, you incentivize the status quo and it becomes hard for new parties to emerge. But the flip side of it is it means that political parties aren't running after private money. And what we have here and you have in America is that. And if you, like, the system we currently have, if you look at what happens in America is, you know, in America right now, you're seeing that the Build Back Better bill, Biden's bill, has basically been held up by Joe Manchin, the Democrat in West Virginia, who is completely backed by the coal industry. It's just, like, frankly, it's crazy for the planet that that's what's happening. So, you know, I think there's enough bits of legislation in different parts of the world that you wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel to make it work better than it does now. Like, frankly, almost anything is better the way it works now. So there's things you can do. No system is perfect, of course, but there's a lot you could do to make it better than it is at the moment.
Fantastic. Can I have a huge round of applause for Peter Galen, please? Peter is so anti-corruption that he hasn't brought any books with him to sell because he was worried some of you might buy a book in order to be able to ask a question. So you'll have to buy them from other places and sign them yourself. We're now going to have a short break. We're going to listen to the beautiful music of the You and Bleach Trio, and we're going to get large drinks. See you in about 10 minutes.
have a book of I don't know, blues?
What?
A blues?
Would I?
Dope head blues?
Okay. See.
Cool. I haven't learned the right signals yet.
Just give us a look and then we'll know.
A big round of applause for the wonderful You and Bleach trio. Fantastic. Right, let's clear the stage. Let's move the giant frightening bear out of the way. This is very exciting. So we're now moving on to our business section. I realise we've had a few things that have been a bit businessy so far, but this is the real business section. So can I encourage you all, grab your seats, grab your dogs if you're Anna Pojajski, grab your children if you're down here. Grab your drinks if you like drinks. I really like drinks, if anyone has a spare one they haven't touched. I'll deal with that for you. Do grab your places, and I'm going to bring up our business editors. It's very exciting. So our next business story, one thing you might not know about me is I'm from a little place called Nottingham. I'm not from London at all. Yes, quite right. That was why I was shitting on Derby earlier. Yeah, as soon as you hear someone shit on Derby, you know they're from Nottingham. And Nottingham is famous throughout the world for producing fags, Nurofen bikes, and Robin Hood. Nurofen was invented in Beeston. Did you know that? Yeah, and the high rate of gun death. Not so much anymore. I was listening to Radio 5, and a man from Nottingham Council said, actually, we've only got the third highest rate of gun deaths now. Just like when your claim to fame is you're not as rough as Glasgow, that is not good. Anyway, right, enough about Nottingham. The point is, Nottingham invented Robin Hood, and our business editor is telling what can only be described as a Robin Hood story, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. So, lovely people, there's two people coming up. We have the business editor, and we have the business editor's interlocutor. Is that the person who asks questions? Yes, good, right. So I did it there. I didn't know the word for it, but now I know the word for it. So, lovely people, are you ready to meet your two business editors? Wait. The island of lethargy it's no good now, just after we've all finished. But you try hard. Please welcome up to the stage Pete Sangham and Ben Machel. They're still walking. You have to keep clapping until they get there.
I think that's the first and probably last time I'll be called a business editor. I'm here just to help facilitate Ben, really. And we're going to talk about his book, The Unusual Suspect. And you could describe it as a true crime story. And obviously that's a genre that's exploded recently, but I think it's fair to say that I've never seen a true crime story like this. Story of a lad, Stephen Jackley, from a sleepy town in Devon, who went on a crusade or a crime spree, depending on your point of view. Actually, Ben, you tell us a bit about who he is.
No, you're doing really well. I was fascinated. The story of Stephen Jackley is essentially one of a young man who, in the run-up to the global financial crisis around 2008, I think he did what a lot of people, or probably what a lot of us did, which was to look around and just sort of think, see what was happening in terms of inequality, in terms of the role that global finance played in how the world was going. And he thought, God, someone should do something. And what he decided was that he would do something, and what that thing would be to become a bank robber, would be to rob from the rich and give to the poor. And completely by himself, he came to this realization that he had this moral obligation to steal, to rob banks, and to do with the proceeds something that would change the world. And so over about an 8-month period, he did what he planned. He carried out a string of bank robberies across Devon, where he lived, and around the West Midlands, where he was ostensibly a geography student at the University of Worcester, whereas in reality he was this other thing as well. He was this wanted criminal, and the police just couldn't work out who he was and how he was getting away, and really what was motivating him. And that's, he's the central protagonist of the book that I've written, and I hope that's interesting enough for the time being.
I guess one thing that makes it more interesting is that he came to rob banks from a place of having had no criminal experience, no criminal tendencies?
Yeah, so one of the really things that kind of drew me to his story was you kind of look at what he did, and he is a shy, socially isolated guy who had, you know, he only discovered, he was only diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum after he'd been captured and after he'd been in jail for a number of years. But really, it had this childhood that was completely isolated. You know, his mother suffered terribly with schizophrenia. She was in and out of institutions throughout his childhood. His father had his own mental health issues. And he really kind of grew up outside of society. He grew up not really making connections with people and increasingly kind of living in a world that he constructed for himself. And one of the things that I suppose really kind of drew, I suppose sort of kept, the question I kept asking was, how does someone arrive at this point? Because obviously it's really interesting, you know, robbing banks is like, you know, kind of interesting, like how do you do it, and what does it feel like, and what the challenge is. But for me, it was getting to this point of you speaking to someone who in some ways is very rational and in some ways really compassionate about other people and about the suffering of other people and about the injustice that he perceives in the world. But then it's like, how do you get to this point where you're like, and then what I need to do is put on a balaclava and get a replica gun and just rob banks? Like, and I'm not saying it to be funny, but it's kind of like, how do you get to that point? Like, how do you arrive at that point? And I think that was one of the things that really kind of sustained me as I kind of thought, okay, I've got to write a book about this. It's just that question of like arriving at this point and making that moral call that this is the right thing to do.
And how did you come to find the story and come to then not only write an article about it, but then write a book about it?
So I was just in the office. So I'm a feature writer for the Times newspaper, and I was just trying to look busy, just looking for stuff to write about. Just when you're just clicking through links, kind of semi-conscious. And then I think there was it was just like a local Devon newspaper, something about Robin Hood bank robber. And so you click on that, and then you sort of start to read, and then you kind of sort of, everything goes 20/20 vision all of a sudden, and you think, okay, all right. And essentially I just came across him online, and you know, I think he'd written letters from prison. He was out of prison by this point, but he was trying to apologise for the pain that it caused people and the trauma they put them through. And so I Googled him, and then I just kind of thought, oh my, yeah, I kind of need to speak to this guy if I can. And then I got in contact with him, and I just said, look, you probably don't want to do this, and I'm sorry to ask, but could I just come and see you and just kind of talk about what you did? Because I'm sure we'll get into what he did kind of spiraled far behind his control. And to my surprise and sort of quiet delight, he kind of agreed to. He said, yeah. So I went to Bristol, where he was living at the time, and I met him in a office space above a Oxfam, and we sort of just talked for about sort of nearly 3 hours, and then I sort of, you know, about what he did and why he did it and how he felt and all these things. And then I came out and it was just like, oh, I would do it for my children here. I said, oh no, I've got to write a book about this guy because it's just too, you know, I'll never forgive myself if I don't. So that's how I encountered him. And luckily for me, you know, I'll just say it now, you know, he robbed probably about 10 banks and building societies and bookmakers, and he was never captured. He got away every time, but his actions led him down this path of believing he needed to get himself a real gun, like an actual real pistol. And after a series of misadventures around the world, in Turkey and Holland and Birmingham, he ended up going to America, to New Hampshire, where he was eventually captured and arrested. And sorry, what was the question?
It was how you found him and how you came to be writing about him. First, you wrote an article, right? First.
Yeah. Sorry. So I was like, that was really interesting, Steve. Thanks. So I wrote an article, and then I think the thing that I realised was that he was as curious as I was to really understand how he'd got to that point and how events had kind of essentially gone beyond his control, and how he had lost himself to this fantasy that he'd embarked on with the best intentions. And I was incredibly fortunate that he was in that place where he was just kind of like, he needed to understand. He had spent, he ended up spending a long time in solitary confinement in a federal prison when he was first captured, because the US police, they thought he was like an international, possibly part of an anarchist terrorist cell. They found his diaries, which he was a meticulous diary keeper. He kept them all with him. Obviously, he brought them with him to America, so if he was captured, it was really obvious he was a criminal. But he had them on him. And he tried to escape from the US Marshals once they had, in fact, captured him, which, if you're ever captured by the US Marshals, just don't try and escape, just don't. And I suppose he wanted to know how it got, what had happened and why, and that was a huge help when it came to actually producing a book about his actions.
When I first came across the book, the first thing that I thought about it was like there was this Robin Hood element, which he himself describes himself as, and also this sort of almost genius way that he evaded capture so many times. So it's like a sort of cross between Robin Hood and sort of a Rain Man type figure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes which I guess kind of runs throughout the book is in the character and the personality of Stephen Jackley. It's this kind of constant tension between someone who is in some ways completely hyper-rational. He has, as his starting point, from a very, from his teenage years onwards, adolescent years onwards, he's looking at the world and he's writing in his journals obsessively about just how unfair it is, about how there are so many billions of people who are being absolutely shafted by this global financial system that we've got, by international capitalism, and it's true. And he's kind of talking about how, well, there's only so many resources in the planet, and loads of people have this, sign up to this system of believing that we have to consume as much as possible. So what's going to happen, guys? Like, this is weird. And he's got this kind of, this absolute clarity in some respects. And he applies that kind of logic, this really clear-eyed approach to robbing banks. He's never broken the law before, but when he decides this is what he's going to do, he sort of Googles it. He's like, how do you rob a bank? Like, what should you do? And he kind of he bones up on successful bank robbers. And he looks at what they did, and what they did was, well, they had stashes of clothes, in woodland and in easily accessible places, in various places. So you could kind of, he had options when it came to escaping, and they never ran. They always walked, as to not to kind of attract attention. And all these things, he's like, right, okay, I will do that then. That makes sense. I will do that. And you kind of think, wow, that's really clever. And then there's this other part of him, which is like, but you're robbing banks, and it's not going. And you have this idea. His plan was that if he could get to £100,000 worth of takings, which he'd hoped to do in one go, he didn't plan to kind of, do a string of heists. He wanted to kind of hit the jackpot. Then he would go clean. Then he would use that money as seed money to set up an organisation, which would kind of, attract like-minded people, and they'd set up NGOs. They'd set up scholarships for people, in the third world. It kind of just saved the research living underwater and living on the moon and stuff. And you're going, no, that's not going to happen, Stephen. Like, that isn't, in some ways you're very, 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 very rational, but there's this kind of 10% at the end where it's like, and that's complete fantasy. And this kind of tension between fantasy and reality is one of the things which I suppose through the course of his story and through the course of his actions kind of becomes more and more acute.
Yeah, that sort of large proportion of rationality and then less so. That's kind of what I make a note of. He has this. He meticulously plans these escapes, right? And he, like you say, he stashes clothes in places, and he evades. I guess, the Midlands Police, the Exeter Police. But then he does things like he tells the... he ends up in Turkey at one point. He tells the Turkish interpreter that that he's actually wanted. They've just let him go, and then he tells her that he's wanted in Holland, and then they take him back.
Yeah. I mean, it's I wouldn't want to kind of sit here and say, oh, this is like a funny story, because it's not. It's one which, in so many ways, is sad, and there are lots of people who are affected really negatively by it. Not least of all Stephen. However, there are bits which are quite funny because he has these plans. And, and sometimes they work. But, as Paul said, when he decides that he needs a real gun, people aren't taking him seriously enough. People aren't afraid enough. People aren't taking him to the vault where he imagines all the money will be. And he just has a series of, one misadventure after another. There's a bank in Worcester, and he's like, right, and there's some offices above it. And in the middle of the night, he breaks in, and he's like, I'll go through the offices, and I'll break into the bank and get to the vault. And he breaks into the offices at night, and surprise, surprise, you can't actually just... There's not like a door that goes to the vault from these offices. And in a peak of anger and frustration, he ransacks the place. And then the following day on the news, he hears that the Worcester branch of the NSPCC has been ransacked, and he's beside himself with horror, because this is the complete opposite of what he'd planned. And then over the coming months, he anonymously puts all this cash through the letterbox of the Worcester NSPCC, because he needs to pay them back for the damage that he did when he was upset because he couldn't get to the vault through the bank. And it's just kind of like, Stephen, I mean, that's really kind of, but like, what did you think was going to happen? Like, there's a big door blocking my way. And he's just like, it's a bank. Like, of course there's a big door blocking your way. And another example might be when he goes to Turkey, and he wants to get this real gun. And he gets what he thinks is a real gun. It turns out to be a replica. And his plan to smuggle it back is to just wrap it in tinfoil and put it through the X-rays. And he's a really intelligent guy. In his diaries, he writes pages and pages about space-time and particle physics and stuff. But it's like, Stephen, even I know how X-rays work. Like, wrapping it in tinfoil is just... And obviously, like, it went through and all the lights started flashing and all these Turkish security guards bundled him. And he was just like, yeah, I just thought it would work. And I think maybe what these moments demonstrate is just the role that fantasy kind of increasingly begins to play in his actions, because he needs to believe that these increasingly far-fetched plans will work. He has this faith. He has this faith that it will happen. But that faith takes him to increasingly kind of, I suppose, outlandish places.
Do you think or to what extent do you think the Asperger's sort of exacerbated what was going on with him in terms of what he did, but also the ordeal that he had when he was locked up?
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of the questions, and I'm not an expert at all on the autism spectrum. I think one thing that I should be really clear about is that it wasn't a superpower that allowed him to do these things. It's not a thing that would just disinhibited him and let him do this. Really, how do you kind of disentangle something like that from someone's personality? And I spent a lot of time trying to work that out, and the truth is that you cannot. It's baked in. It's a chicken and egg sort of scenario. I think more than anything, the social isolation that he experienced, partly because of his incredibly dramatic family life. His mother was forcibly institutionalized several times, often by the police, during his childhood. I think his father was almost certainly bipolar, and he was just apart. He didn't have brothers or sisters. He didn't have any friends. He had one friend, in fact, during his entire childhood and adolescence, whose father just happened to be someone who worked with people on the autism spectrum. So his friend got it. His friend understood. Very few other few people did. And I think something which was, I guess, occurred to me was just the role that the isolation played in his choices, and this idea that, you know, if you had just a couple of people who had just got you and didn't really judge you and understood that you could sometimes be pedantic or a little bit kind of obsessive about particular things, or sometimes almost a bit curt, or, you know, if there were maybe 2 or 3 people around when he was 17, 18, who could just say, yeah, no, it is unfair, like these things are bad, but you cannot, like, don't rob banks, because that's not gonna help. Then his life would have been very, very different. But the fact is, he didn't have those people around, and I think that more than anything, that was to do with the way that he was kind of pared away from society, not because of a particular condition, but just because of the circumstances of his life, which were much bigger than just one particular kind of one particular label.
Yeah,
Paul and Ben, do you mind if do you want to take any questions from the audience? Because we're running short on time,
Yeah,
so
of course,
now is a good time to...
There's one.
Thank you. As somebody who always wanted to be a bank manager since I was about 10-year-old, which is really sad, I actually worked in a bank branch and there was a robbery.
Yeah.
How can you justify giving this criminal, who's a convicted criminal, a story, and giving him a voice, who's terrorised innocent people in an environment where I'm doing my day job?
Yeah.
How can you justify giving that person a platform where he's a convicted criminal?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the people who... Stephen's not the only person I interviewed in the book. You know, I interviewed people involved in the law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic. I also interviewed, you know, some of his victims, including a guy called Luke, who worked at it wasn't a bank, it was a bookmaker's. And he described how he was closing up. He was a 20-year-old student who played for University of Worcester rugby team. And he went to the gents' toilets just to check, and there was Stephen with a balaclava and a knife. And he described how he was told to kind of sit on the floor, you know, with a knife at his throat. And, well, Stephen escaped. And the next day, he went into lectures, went to rugby training, and then had a complete breakdown. And he's not been able to sleep with the light off, you know, for the next 6-7 years. You know, he's severely traumatized, and this is just one person. And throughout the book, you know, in speaking to police, we get other examples of the victim statements, essentially. And one of the things which I try to address in the book is his difficulty in understanding the long-lasting psychological impact on of his actions, because to him, in the moment, the way his mind worked was that these people, when I leave, they're fine. I've not killed anyone, I've not hurt anyone. I'm doing this as a means to an end to get from A to B, and yes, they will be scared, but by the time I'm gone, they will not be scared because I'm gone. And I'm not saying that kind of justifies writing a book, but the very trying to get to grips and him understanding gradually the harm he has caused is a big part of the book, is a big part of his story.
Fantastic. Who else would like to ask?
I'll talk to you.
They're going to have a chat. Anyone else? Brilliant. Right, can I have a huge round of applause for Paul and Ben? Wonderful, wonderful chance now to run to the bar, refill whatever you're drinking from. Paper
waving at them. We're going to try and do interviewees. Are we ready? Are we ready? Are we ready? If I hold them over, is it going to work? Yeah. Interviewees, come. Leave the dog. Leave the dog. Leave the dog. No, dog is too loud.
Wasn't our dog barking?
Well, that's very good. Where do you want us? How far away?
Take a couple steps back.
Sorry, cushions and dog. Oh. It's weird doing filming without being able to see stuff.
It's true.
I'm so used now to the little...
So true.
Check my... Got to rely on someone else.
It's so true.
Tell me as soon as you're live. Are you rolling? Hello there. Hello, YouTube people. I thought it might be quite nice for you to get a feel for what is actually happening here live. So what I've done is I've got a first-time speaker, Anna, got first-time attendee, Neve, and they're going to tell you about what it's like to be here and what they're enjoying. So I'll hold a mic between you. You can both talk into it, but you have to get your face near it. How are you enjoying the whole thing so far?
It's super fun. It's a lovely, lovely crowd. Great vibes. We brought our dog here today. Dogs are welcome. Kids are welcome. It's very chill. It's the perfect thing to do on a Sunday.
I think we have 8 dogs. 8 dogs of varying sizes today. No dog fights have broke out. It has been close a couple of times. So Anna's obviously being paid to be here, so it has to say that. You're not. What's it like coming along and sitting... Well, I don't know what you normally do on a Sunday afternoon. Is this similar?
It's similar but marginally more classy. What I would describe this as is like the ideal dinner party, in that you get to meet everyone you would want to chat to, but they actually do talk to you, and it doesn't matter. You don't have to get invited. You can just come along. It's wonderful. So yeah, the variety is really nice, and the variety in talks is super good. So as someone who likes a bit of this and a bit of that, and I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, the variation from talk to talk is so valuable. So yeah, it's a perfect atmosphere to learn something interesting and new.
And other than Anna, who's standing here, so we can't comment on her, who is the best? Speak. And other than me, of course. What was the bit that's really grabbed you so far?
Both of you obviously accepted. I think Peter Gagan's talk about corruption in politics in the UK was the most interesting to me. I think there's just such depth in that. And I think what I love most is the ability for a setting like this to give you a conversational style of interview where you, as an audience, get to genuinely participate. That really draws me in as a person who likes to attend these sorts of things.
Plus, as interviewer, I get to sit on a chaise long. Now, Anna, I want to ask you about the perks of being a Sunday Papers Live speaker. Have you had any good food, any good drinks?
I had a very strong gin and tonic, actually, but after my talk. Yeah.
That's very brave. I had a very strong cocktail before I started talking. Fantastic. And what were you, for those people who are only just tuning in, what were you telling us about?
I was talking about materials and my granddad George's life story and how that intersected with plastic and the history of plastic.
And people who are here can buy books live and get them signed. Anna, is your book available on websites that YouTube people can click on?
Absolutely. It's available on all the usual book-selling websites. It's called Handmade by Anna Pajajski.
Yeah, and they'll know how to spell Pajajski, obviously. Brilliant. Thank you both so much for telling me about your experiences. I'm going to go and buy both of our people a drink now. So thank you all very much, YouTube. We'll see you back on stage in a couple of minutes. Thanks. Can I have a huge round of applause, please? It's coming. It's coming.
Yes, huge round of applause to you and these trio, please.
Now, I'm going to shovel all these people away from the stage. Take the doggy and go. You stay there. I'll introduce you. Don't worry, we're going to do it all profesh. Can I encourage you to grab your seats, put your dogs away, take yourself out, do whatever it is you need to do. I'm going to introduce our actual travel editor. I introduced a travel editor earlier because I forgot what we were doing because my cocktail was very strong. They were actually the culture editor. This is the real travel editor. Now, Benedict Allen is obviously somebody who's been all over the world and written about it and filmed it. I just want to tell you a couple of quick facts. Benedict just told me he is the person who popularized the video selfie. Holding a camera and talking into it, this man. It's all his fault. He invented the world as it is now. You can blame him for that later. And also, when he stands on this stage, he has done, I think, 6 TV series. So when you see him on the stage, and you're like, is that the guy who... It is him. It is definitely him. So, lovely people, are you ready to meet your travel editor? Would you please welcome to the stage Benedict Allen?
Thank you. How lovely. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Even at the back. Even at the back. I wasn't meant to be. I wasn't boasting about the. I thought it was a bit embarrassing that I did this videos thing, and that was actually quite a few years ago. The telly stuff. So it's not me you're thinking of. It's Bear Grylls. I think. Anyway. Right. Yes. I'd like to talk about being an explorer because I'm seen as an explorer, certainly by some people, and so I'd like to talk about that. But to start at the beginning, I'd like to talk about how I got into it. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about you. Because if you were ever the sort of child who, like me, went walking along a rocky beach, you are an explorer. I was very much that sort of child. Maybe just like me, you used to look at rock pools and investigate things that you found in the woods or whatever, and you found yourself keeping going. And that, to me, is what being an explorer is all about. But I thought, this is really, really good. I really liked doing this, looking at rock pools and that sort of thing. And my dad was a test pilot, and he was one of the people who developed the Vulcan bomber. Does anyone remember the Vulcan bomber? Yeah, that hasn't been out very much lately, but it's a sort of disused aircraft now. But in its heyday, back in the 1960s, this airplane carried our nuclear deterrent. And I was incredibly proud seeing my dad fly over the back garden with this Vulcan bomber, huge aircraft, and very sort of noisy one as well. I remember him coming low over the back garden and tipping the wings to indicate he was at the controls. And I thought, one day I want to be like my dad and be some sort of pioneer. So I clung on to this dream of being a sort of pioneer and explorer, someone who heads off beyond the golf course. The golf course was at the end of the garden. I don't see my dad flying off in that direction. I thought, I want to do that. I was only about 5, but I developed this idea, being an explorer. I knew I couldn't be a test pilot, frankly. Even at 5, I knew I was sort of not reliable. I'm far too passionate about things. But as I grew up, through school, through university, I clung on to this dream. I would be an explorer. I'd go off and discover exciting things about the world. And that was very much my dream, but I was hanging on to it with increasing desperation because I realized I didn't have the one thing it really takes: money. I know I sound incredibly posh, but that was because my granny, in some ways, sort of paid for my schooling. I don't know if she's one of the bank robbers that you were talking about earlier. Maybe she sort of... I don't know, well, she wasn't Robin Hood, that's for sure. But anyway, she managed to get hold of a whole lot of money, and somehow I got through this school. And my dad was moving around being a pilot and so on, so maybe that's why I ended up at a posh school. One way or another, though, we didn't seem to have any cash lying around. I thought, how am I going to do it? I worked in a warehouse. I got myself at last to the Amazon, the first place I'd ever dreamt of as being somewhere exciting that I'd like to go to. So there I was, at last, in this place I'd dreamt of ever since a little boy. And it was absolutely horrible. I couldn't believe it. 100% humidity, insects screaming in my ears, the sort of death all around me. And I discovered, I don't know if you've had this yourself, you can't wear the same pair of underpants for more than, say, a couple of weeks. Because fungi grows in all the crevices, if you know what I mean. So this was a total nightmare, this place. It was such a disappointment. And it wasn't just the local wildlife that was trying to sort of kill me off. It was the local people as well. I was paddling along in my canoe one day, and I found myself being chased and shot at by two people. And that was disappointing, because by this stage I was living in Shepherd's Bush, and it seemed exactly the same there. Actually, that's a cheap joke, isn't it? But I was in Shepherd's Bush today. It's fine, actually. I rather like it. But nonetheless, I was being shot at this day. And I'd love to say I was really brave. I paddled along really bravely, because I'm British, wouldn't panic too much. But these bullets were going past my head. I now know I had gone right past Pablo Escobar. Do you remember? Yeah. Perhaps some of you worked with him once. But he at this stage was on the run. He was killed 6 months later in Medellin, his headquarters. At this stage, he was down on the Peru, Brazil, Colombia border. These three countries meet in the Amazon, and he was evading the law by hopping over the border. And anyway, I'd unfortunately gone past him, and he'd sent two people to kill me. So these people were chasing me. I was in my canoe, paddling away as fast as I could, people behind me, and these shots were ringing out, pew, pew, past my head. It really was a bad day. I mean, really terrible. And well, you can imagine, I don't know why I'm laughing about it, but it was a bad time. And yet they didn't kill me. These bullets kept on missing. I thought, what's wrong with these people? I mean, really, it was a sitting... I'm very large, and I was only ahead of these people. They were in their boat. I was only maybe 100 meters behind, or ahead. And these bullets kept on missing. I got quite curious after a time, and I turned around and discovered these people were having a bit of trouble with their multitasking. And I'm sure the ladies here would say that a lot of men have this problem. But actually, it was quite a serious case of multitasking. They couldn't paddle a canoe and kill someone at the same time. And it was really bad. They'd pick up the rifle, and the canoe would swing round to the side. They'd have to put the rifle down, pick up the paddle, straighten it up again, have another think, pick up the rifle. And last I saw of these two people was them going round and round in circles, hopelessly stuck in the shallows. So I got away with it. I got round the corner of this forested area and jumped into the trees. And suddenly I was safe. And this incident, in all seriousness, I suppose, had probably only taken a couple of minutes. It was a horrendous couple of minutes, but it was over as soon as I jumped into the trees. And it was a huge reminder to me that day that the forest could be on our side, and on my side in particular, someone who wanted to explore these places. Because, of course, there were local people living in that forest. There were the indigenous people. They saw the forest as their food, their medicine, their shelter, everything. So I thought, if I could just turn to the local people, then maybe I could survive in this place and learn to see it as the locals see it, rather than as an outsider. So I thought, I'm going to come back one day and try and cross the whole of the Amazon basin. If I can do that one day, then I'll know I am a proper sort of explorer. So that's the dream I had in my mind. I'll come back to it in just a second. But obviously, I knew I needed preparation in order to fulfill this dream. And I went off to various places around the world to try and learn about the rainforest, and in particular through the eyes of the local people, indigenous people who knew so much about it. I went to Papua New Guinea, to the Sepik area. This was a very fascinating area because I understood the young boys were taken away to be made into men as strong as crocodiles. That's the phrase the elders used. I thought, that sounds amazing. I could see some of the younger men who I was getting to know now had been through the crocodile initiation ceremony, as it was called, and they had scars running up and down their chest and back, hundreds of little bumps, little stipules that represented the crocodile. Obviously a great role model in the rainforest. Tough predator, highly territorial, good animal if you're going to survive in the malarial swamplands where the people in the Sepik lived. So I said to this young man, this is amazing. He said, yes, and if you have the courage of your convictions, you call yourself an explorer, you should do what it takes. And what it takes for us is to go through the ceremony to become a man as strong as a crocodile. I can't remember actually ever saying yes to this, but I remember some elders jumping up and down with excitement in the village. I said, what's happened? Something wonderful happening. He said, yes, we can't believe it. The first outsider ever is going to go through our brutal initiation ceremony. And it's you. I thought, oh no. I sort of began counting out my aspirins and so on. Big fence was erected around the spirit house, and I had my head shaven with all the other young men who I now knew quite well, and together we were led into the crocodile nest and made into men as strong as crocodiles. It was a complicated process. I can't go into all of it. In my case, obviously, it's quite difficult to make me as strong as anything very much. But I'll just give you brief highlights. We were led to upside-down turn canoes and cut repeatedly with bamboo blades. Lost about 2 pints of blood. What else can I tell you about it? I don't know if any of you have got a phobia. I've got a phobia, it turns out, about being cut repeatedly with a bamboo blade. I hated it. I really had. We lost, as I say, 2 pints of blood. Couldn't even stand up afterwards. But the worst thing, I know, well, let's be positive. The thing is, we knew we'd never go through anything so bad in our lives. That's a great feeling. You know you've been through hell, and you're sort of surely better for that. The trouble is, we were totally wrong. This is one of the easier days. Turns out it wasn't the worst thing of our life. The next few days, in fact, the next few weeks, were going to be much, much worse because we were repeatedly beaten 5 times every day. And this went on for 5 or 6 weeks. So I was getting sick of this after a while. And as I say, I can come back and talk to you about the joys of the initiation ceremony. That won't take very long to answer that one. I can talk about the horrible side. But coming out of the initiation ceremony, I knew my strengths, I knew my weaknesses, as did other young men. Of course, joking aside, a huge privilege to have been allowed to go through something that enabled these young men to take care of their community in such a difficult environment. I went on from the New Guinea and swamplands to other places around the world, and at last came back to the Amazon, to this place I dreamt of as a boy, and to the place I had a dream of trying to cross. I lived with the Matses. The Matses, another indigenous people. Unfortunately, they have an entirely different role model, not the crocodile, but the jaguar. And I had to start all over again. The Matses, they had spines they put in their lips that represented jaguar whiskers, and they had tattoos across their face. So trying to take on the strength, agility, and intelligence of a jaguar. Not the crocodile, but the jaguar. 2 top role models, highly effective animals, obviously, predators in the forest. And the Matses, likewise, were less river people. They were nomads who hunted in the forest. So a great role model for them. And I remember I was adopted by a man called Pablito. He was a very busy man, and he had lots and lots of children. One day, I said to him, how many children have you got, Pablito? He said, oh, just the 38. And it always sounded like a sort of underestimate. And I now know it was, actually. I went back there a couple of years later. Anyway, joking aside, as I say, he was a very busy man. And he got rather sick of having to teach me how to hunt. Because if you've got a lot of children to feed, well, you don't want someone with huge paratrooper boots who's almost 2 meters tall, crashing through the forest, scaring away the pigs, the monkeys, and all the rest. So he got really sick of trying to teach me, and he passed me on to one of his brothers. Brother got sick of teaching me, passed me on to one of his children. Starting to get really, really embarrassing. I remember this little boy, I suppose he was about 12 years old. He got sick of teaching me. He thought he was going to make a man of me, and that was a big mistake. You know, I humiliated him in front of the whole village. He tied up little animals in the forest so that I would come back with something so that he could show off in the village. And everything really, it was really unlucky. Everything escaped somehow before we could ever get back to the village. So we never came back with anything. He passed me on to his younger brother, who was only 5 years old. It really was bad. And he decided far more exciting than hunting with me was simply hunting me. And that's what he did. He only was allowed a toy bow and arrow, and he just used to zap me with these arrows. Boom, I'd get another one in the bum, and he'd think it was hilarious. And then after a few days of that, he got bored, and his chums would set up little booby traps in the forest, and I'd be walking along trying to dodge his arrows, and I'd fall through a big hole in the forest floor. In the end, I had to be rescued by his older sister, who was called Lucy. And Lucy was only 8 years old, but I realized the skills this girl had, unbelievable. The boys were amazing hunters, even as children, the girls were great gatherers, and that's how the Matzes worked. The girls were gatherers of herbs and medicines and some food, and the boys were the hunters. And I thought, how am I going to cope in this world? Well, eventually Pablito thought I was going to die on his hands, I think, at this stage. He realized he had a slow learner, and he decided to take me under his wing, and he began teaching me various things. Essentially, he taught me how to read the forest and see it as somewhere that was a resource, because it's a confusing, bewildering place. Where do you begin with this place of all these highly specialized, highly competitive species around you, the insects, the predators, all the rest. He taught me how to use half a dozen of everything effectively, half a dozen palms that you could use as shelters, half a dozen herbs for malaria and so on. So he broke it down so that I could recognize friends, as it were, in this great crowded world of the forest. And off I went alone to walk 300 miles through the forest. And I was very worried about how I was going to cope with this. The Matzes were even more worried. I remember two men walked me to the edge of the Matzes territory and turned away sadly, crying. And one of them said to the other, "Oh, the saddest thing is no one's going to be able to bury him." I thought, oh, cheer up, you know, might cope. I mean, by this stage, you know, years had gone by, I did know something about the rainforest. Anyway, I carried on going. And it got worse and worse, effectively. I got weaker and weaker. I wasn't up to scratch. The Matzes and the first people, the so-called crocodile people, the Nyara, they knew it was all about working together. That's what the initiation ceremony was all about. You've got to work together in a competitive world. Same in your world as well. Humans are pretty good alone, but we work better together. We're social creatures. And slowly, I was getting weaker and weaker walking through the forest. I realized how bad things were when I came to a tree in the forest. Instead of looking for monkeys there, because it's a big fig tree, fruit tree, I was in fact, well, I had no hope of hunting the monkeys. I realized I was just looking for handouts, because monkeys would chuck down fruit. No, it was terrible. You may laugh. It was getting pretty bad. Basically, I was reliant on these handouts. I was reliant on luck being on my side, and it was no longer really on my side. I got malaria, I got weaker and weaker. Effectively, I knew now I was going to die. And then a miracle happened. I bumped into some illegal loggers. And these people couldn't believe it when I staggered out of the trees. I was incredibly excited just to see another human. I've been going for about 3 weeks now, alone. I was very, very lonely, very, very scared. And these people came and greeted me. They said, "You have got to be British." I mean, everyone's saying, "What are you doing out here all alone?" Anyway, they turned out to be quite nice people, and the man in charge of the logging camp said, "Look, we're going to help you. 2 men will walk with you through the forest." And these 2 men did walk with me off through the forest, helped carry my bags. We came to a little river one day, we cut a tree down to make it a bridge, and the 2 men very kindly picked up my 2 bags and walked across this tree to the other riverside. I was just about to join them, get on this tree, and join the men and join my bags, when they turned round and kicked the tree away and walked off into the forest, having effectively robbed me, and now they're going to leave me to die. I was furious. Can you imagine? Anyway, it was now probably 100 miles from the outside world. I thought, I don't stand a chance. But after what, it takes quite a long time to die in the rainforest, effectively. I was sort of sitting there. The men had gone. My way to my luggage was gone. I didn't have anything. So I just sat there like this on the tree trunk, obviously no one watching. And there I was sitting thinking, oh dear, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. Oh, I'm still going to die. Anyway, time went by and I still hadn't died as I sat there. I thought, oh, I've got to try and make an effort here. And I thought of my mum, and I thought of anyone else who might sort of want me back, perhaps. And then I thought of that little girl, Lucy. I thought, if an 8-year-old can survive out here and see this place as her home, maybe even I can manage. So I jumped into the river, didn't have to worry about luggage, which was a bonus, you know, swam across the river. I thought, what I'm going to do is try and rob back one of my bags. And that's what I did. I stalked these 2 men, just like that little girl Lucy had, who showed me how to track through the forest. I came to where these 2 loggers were setting up a little camp for the night, and waited till it got dark, got back one of my bags. And effectively now I stood a chance, and I kept on going. And to be honest, I knew I couldn't envisage walking 100 miles. It's a long, long way. It's like from here to Bristol, I suppose, or Bath. I don't know if you ever go down the M4. Anyway, it's not that direction. But anyway, it's the same distance. It's a long, long way, 100 miles. And to walk through forest without a map, I thought vaguely, I had a compass for my survival kit. I thought I'll head off southeast. But I couldn't really believe I could do it. And belief is so crucial in order to pull off anything. Again, same in your world. Got to have belief. And what I thought I'll do is count every pace. And every 100 paces, I'll make a little mark on a stick. And then I have a log of how far I've got as I head off southeast with my compass. And that's what I did. I had a little stick. I marked off every 100 paces with my stick. By the end of that first day, I thought, ooh, this is quite good. I've done quite well. And I began to get back a little more belief. And I got a bigger stick. And I thought, if I ever get to the end of this big stick, surely I will have got to the outside world. And now I began to visualize that forest. I could visualize my route through it. And I could also remember back now to my dream of crossing the whole of the Amazon basin, because I thought, when I get to the end of that stick, I will have done that. I will have pulled off my dream. And that's now what I did. I notched up on that stick, and with this growing sense of progress, a growing sense of belief in myself, made my way day after day through the forest, eating whatever I could, piranhas and so on in the streams, surviving just with this one bag, and finally popped out of the forest. I'd love to say I looked like Indiana Jones at this stage, hurrah, got out of the forest, or some sort of ancient explorer. It wasn't like that. I looked like a total wreck. But nonetheless, I pulled off my childhood dream. And more than that, I'd done this journey that was, all modesty aside, it was quite a thing to have walked effectively 200 miles by myself. So you're probably thinking, oh, so what? It's quite an interesting story, but does this have any relevance to me? And I think, well, I said very glibly right at the beginning that I think we're all explorers. I don't know if any of you heard, about 4 years ago, there was this bloke who got lost in New Guinea. Does anyone remember? It became sort of headlines all the way around the world. That bloke was me, and I had simply gone back to Papua New Guinea to see one of the people who'd been so good to me as a young man. I mentioned, for me, it's all about turning to the local people, hearing their skills. And that is what I've done through my years. Gone to rainforest, gone to the desert, and then Arctic, always turning to local people because they have this fund of information. And I had simply gone back to New Guinea to find one of the people who'd helped me. I did find him. Unfortunately, I got cut off from the outside world when I was leaving. I got malaria yet again. I got dengue fever. Eventually, the Daily Mail come and rescued me. I didn't ask. I'm not going to say anything more. But anyway, I wasn't expecting the Daily Mail. Where was the Guardian? Where was the... Anyway, no. If anyone's from the Daily Mail, wonderful. Anyway, this helicopter, the outside world have been going berserk about this. What is a man in this day and age? What is anyone doing out there in the forest? Thinks he's some sort of explorer when the world has been explored. He thinks he's David Livingstone. He thinks he's some romantic person from another golden age of exploration. Or he's some imperialist, some posh white bloke, yet another one doing his stuff. What I'd say to that is that we all know about climate change now. We all know how little we really do know about the world. Did you know there's only 8% of the species on this planet that have been identified? 8%. We don't understand those 8%. We don't understand all the rest. So there's a huge amount of work we need to do to understand our planet. But I also think that we're all in our own little, what do you call them, echo chambers. We're so connected nowadays with each other through our phones and all the rest, social media. It's incredibly important that some of us step aside. So that is what I see as part of my role, is to disconnect, look at other worlds that are maybe not so comfortable for us. But I also think that exploration isn't about people like me who maybe through the years have got the skill set to go to the Amazon, to New Guinea, Borneo, whatever. It's about all of us. And it's not about the past, David Livingstone and so on. It's about now, and it's about the future. Thank you.
What a pro, as Benedict leaves us with 5 minutes for questions. Who would like to ask Benedict anything about anything? As long as the question isn't, how are you still alive? Benedict, you point at the people you want, and I will run to them with a microphone.
How do you think public school prepared you for Amazon initiation? And number two, didn't you say you had a golf course at the end of your garden?
It was not my golf course. I think it's a very wrong impression. Yeah, we lived in a 1950s house. There was quite a weird house. It was said to be. People had just invented central heating, and this was in Cheshire, in northern-ish England, and it was totally ineffective. And this house was a sort of nightmare place to live. I don't know why my dad didn't seem to earn much money. He was his test pilot. I would have thought he'd be really well paid. We never really had very much money. The public school. So by public school for the British, that means I suppose boarding school, and it did. You know, I was talking about the imperialism that's in exploration. There is this long tradition in the history of exploration for the British and actually for the Europeans, for the Spanish, Portuguese, French, for example, Dutch. They've gone off around the world. And in the British public schools, teach you confidence. They teach you a sense of a certain sort of, that you have a right. It's sort of entitlement, I suppose. We know, think of our Prime Minister, for example. Oh dear. I didn't mean that. I just mean there's a certain sense of Britain's labouring under this sort of class system we've got. But if you go to one of those schools, you sort of come out feeling you were born to rule. And this is how the explorers felt. They had this confidence. They're buoyed up by the Victorian age when the British had one of the earliest industrial revolutions. Sense of confidence. Same thing as from that public school, that sense of entitlement, that you have a right to the narrative of how the world is. So I suppose I was imbued with all that, and I did have a lot of the heroes that public school boys would have had, like Captain Scott of the Arctic, and David Livingstone, and Speke, Burton, Cook. You know, I know a lot of them. I've written a lot about them. For me, I think it worked out differently because I simply didn't have the money in the end. So I had to work in a warehouse, get the money, and then out of financial necessity, I turned to the local people. And it turns out, for me, that was the key. Suddenly, I was trying to explore the world or see the world or understand the world in their terms rather than mine. And it's true that exploration has always been in our terms. Not just the British, for the Arabians as well, the Chinese as well. Explorers go out as ambassadors, perhaps, or as emissaries of their own culture. But I think we're beyond that now. We've all got to try and look and see other places as less exotic, that these places are maybe full of solutions rather than questions.
Benedict, which bit of Cheshire was your 1950s house in?
It's slightly embarrassing because the village has now become incredibly posh. So this is Prestbury, where... Macclesfield, I'm a Mac lad. I was born in Macclesfield.
The thing is, once you say you're from Macclesfield, people are like, yeah, he's down to earth and normal. If you say you're from Prestbury, no.
No, exactly.
Who else has a question for Benedict that isn't nitpicking about Cheshire? I was born in Cheshire.
I picked that up, yeah. Thought you had some axe to grind.
So no axe to grind, just an interest actually. So having spent a little bit of time in Africa, I'm interested to know how you manage the juxtaposition between some of the ceremonies and the rites of passage of the indigenous people versus what we would necessarily perceive as difficult situations to put children through. So circumcision, some of the rites of passage that you talked about, how you managed navigating that, given the fact that watching a grown adult cry about the fact that his children went through some of these scenarios, but justifying the fact that that was okay. So I'd be interested to know from your experience, like how you would validate that and go through it yourself, and then what that means for the kind of broader understanding of humanity. Like, how do we justify that with humanity in the way that we should be behaving with our children?
Oh dear, how does it... For the broader understanding of humanity, blimey. It's such an interesting question because it's something I tussle with all the time, and I don't know what the answer is, because I was a very naive 24-year-old when I went through that. I believed I was immortal, as people do in their early 20s, And I thought I was up for anything. I was incredibly idealistic. I'd only just survived that first experience in the Amazon. So I think nowadays people probably say it was survivor's guilt, or I had some trauma because I had narrowly escaped in the Amazon. I had 2 sorts of malaria, and when I emerged from the Amazon, I was in a mess. So I think perhaps I was trying to come to terms with the forest itself. And I saw that the locals had come to terms with it in their own way, and I thought maybe that's a solution. That's me thinking back now, all those years ago. Then I just thought it was lovely and simple. The locals have this ceremony. I've had this extraordinary chance of going through the ceremony. I mean, I thought, this is amazing. These people have allowed me to go through their ceremony. So I think I was just grateful then. Then I saw I didn't know how severe it was until I went through it, and then I realized. I think it's very difficult because I think the elders saw that they had to do this to their children, even though it caused them a huge amount of pain, the elders. But I've seen this in Kenya. I've talked to women who've circumcised all these girls, and the girl talked to the girls and said, oh yes, it's what we always do. And there seems to be this perpetual self-justification. I remember seeing it at public school as well. That beatings happen because we've always, it's good for you, it's what we do, it's what makes you stronger, all these justifications. For me, the problem is that it's not for me to say, in a way, and yet my job as a so-called explorer, or you could just say a writer, or a witness from the outside world, someone whose duty is to report back, I sort of have to take a stance because I can't be objective, because no one's totally objective. So I try and work it through through my books. And so I talk about, I've got this book, Explorer. Do buy half a dozen each, actually. But no, I try and work through a lot of these problems in this book. Because I went with someone called Frank Gardner, who's a BBC security correspondent. I don't know if you saw this programme we did together. I went with a film crew back to this village where we went through the ceremony. Frank found it unbelievably horrible, the idea that I had put myself through this, but worse, that the locals feel it's justifiable for them. And for me, all I can say as a young man, what happened to me was, in a way, neither here nor there, because it's voluntary. It's not voluntary for the local people. I think for them, though, you have to weigh it against other things like the coherence of the village. It gave them a huge sense of self and a huge amount of pride, the Nyara who'd gone through this. And I think that has to be weighed against this sort of personal pain. There's not a sense of individualism in quite there is way that we have. So there's a sense of acceptance. I personally worried more about the women who didn't go through the ceremony. I know what the pain is like, being beaten and so on, but the women have a very, very tough life in Papua New Guinea, carrying stuff, getting up every morning at 4 in the morning to get the fires going for all the men who are just sitting around drinking and all of that. So I think there's far more complicated issues than simply the initiation ceremony. Women don't have that ceremony, but they have a much harder life. Yeah, it's a hard one to juggle. But I think you have...
Benedict.
That's why it's important to write and discuss these things and not just do a TV programme, I think.
Benedict, I'm going to let you go on a lighter note. I'm going to ask you a question myself. You've reached a point in your career where everybody's going to be asking you to work out what it all meant and where it all adds up and what advice you give to the next set of people coming through. I was thinking, my daughter's 3. She's never going to have money. Her dad is a stand-up comedian who hosts Sunday Papers Live.
Is he any good?
Not as good as you, based on that line. No, fine, I've still got it.
So we do one more question.
I just want to finish you. I've got orders to finish him on a happy question. I'm really sorry. I have to do a happy question so he can finish on it. Have you got a happy question? No, not valid. Happy. Happy.
I will be here. I'll be hanging around in a rather desperate, lonely way by my books, if you want to...
We've had a lot of child torture in the last couple of minutes, so I'm just trying to lift it. I want to say, what words of advice have you got?
Come and ask me in a second. I'll be here.
What words of advice have you got for somebody who's not going to have these advantages? What have you learned that young people can take and build on and go forward?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important when I go to schools to spread the message, to say repeatedly, you are an explorer. I think it's so important because if children have to believe there's a world that's exciting out there, and if they don't, then what hope is there for any of us? Because we rely on these children to be inquisitive. our children are going to take over from us. And if they're not inquisitive about the world, it's very, very sad. And in fact, it'll be the end of us. Every species that lives needs to explore the world. That's what bacteria do. It's what lichen do. And as humans, perhaps more than anything, because we have responsibility to, because we are the most powerful species to get things right. So I think I'd say to children, you are explorers, and you've got to go out there and explore. And it doesn't matter if it's your back garden. It doesn't matter if it's the moon. Very few people alive have had the experience I have, because I was born at a certain time and got myself out early in the last times when the whole landscapes had never been recorded. That experience won't be there, but there's still endless things we don't understand about our planet, and we need to understand about our planet if we're going to survive.
Amazing, I'll tell her that. Thank you so much. Big round of applause for Benedict Allen, please.
Thank you. Do you hear what the question was? Or?
I think if you want to go and take the question personally, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
No?
We all want to hear.
They all want to hear it. The voice of the public has elected you back up to the top. Here it comes.
Sorry. Okay.
Thank you. I often sulk and it works. So my question actually followed on from your question, so we were quite aligned.
Great.
And I think I appreciate that you acknowledged the privilege that you have had in being able to do the exploration you've done. And my question was related to the next generation, but also acknowledging that these stories are also being told by natives, so not just the natural inhabitants, but the natives of these regions. But the platform isn't there for them to tell their story because it's not received unless it's told by somebody that looks like yourself.
Yeah.
So do you see yourself as being able to be in a position where you can raise a platform for the natives that you're meeting, the locals, to tell the story themselves?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I mentioned very briefly about the narrative. It's always been the Europeans who've told the story of the history of exploration and so on. You'll notice I'm not on the cover of this book, because in the end it felt wrong being seen as a hero, because in the end there's a sort of Jungian archetype. There's someone who sets off from his society and comes back with these great tales. For me, it was the place that had to be the hero. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'd like to think that's what I've been doing through my books. What happens in TV, unfortunately, is that I did a series called Last of the Medicine Men. It pretty well finished my TV career, because what I wanted to do was just hear from various shamans, so-called witch doctors, so-called healers, and have their voice. But it's not what people want. They want the sort of gutsy hero. But yeah, the answer is, I think that's an incredibly important part of my duty. And I think there is a sense of that. There needs to be that sense of duty. The world is no longer a playground. It's been treated as a playground for the more affluent of us, maybe as people doing ultramarathons, maybe it's people like me, adventurers, but it can't be seen as that anymore. And we're sort of running out of time because there's so many of these cultures, as you know, are simply disappearing, and their stories are going untold. And it's not just the cultural stories, it's individual stories of heroism. People who've saved their child who's lost in the forest, real heroes doing extraordinary things. And the cultural stories as well that have been handed on and on and on. So I think this is vital, and I hope in my next book will be just that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Benedict. Thank you to our question asker. I think there was some subtext there of there's a few people we need to get off the telly. They want me to roll straight through to the final act, so there's not going to be a break. No break here. So I'm going to bring on our final editor, who is our lifestyle editor. Give me a cheer if you have a lifestyle. My main lifestyle is not leaving the house and getting sweets delivered directly to my face. I've just been enjoying a few raspberry mushrooms. They're not as good as you remember when you were a kid. Now, I'm only telling you about my terrible habits, partly because our final lifestyle speaker has managed to create a hack where she basically uses becoming social media famous as a way to control the worst of her money habits. Is that right? it's quite nice to be able to sort yourself out and, you know, build a career off the back of it. I've managed neither of those things, which is why I'm a stand-up comedian with a daughter who'll never explore anything. Now, our final editor, our lifestyle editor, is called, he says, checking his paperwork, Claire Seal. I remembered it, but I didn't believe I'd remembered it, if you've ever had one of those moments. So, lovely people, are you ready to meet your lifestyle editor? Would you please clap, cheer, go wild, welcome up Claire Seal!
Thank you very much. It's awkward to talk about money, isn't it? Really awkward as soon as anyone mentions the M word, and the second that they start to mention debt, all gets even more awkward. But I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm really thrilled that spaces like this are encouraging us to talk about money, encouraging us to talk about financial well-being, because when we talk about lifestyle, what no one encourages us to do really early enough is any degree of lifestyle design, and to think about how we're going to afford the lifestyle that we want. And I'm not, as was hinted, I'm not talking to you about this from a background in financial advice. I'm not talking to you about this because I've always been excellent with money and I wanted to share my gifts. Quite the opposite, in fact. So for the first 10 years of my adult life, I had a terrible, terrible relationship with money. I had no idea of really what it meant to live within my means. In my household, my parents owned a business, so it was very feast or famine. And the habits and mindset that I learned from that followed me through early adulthood. So in my 20s, I had 2 children and I got married. And then one morning in March 2019, when I was 29, I found myself over 27 grand in debt across 7 different credit cards and an overdraft and a store card. And I found myself on the phone to someone from my bank, and she was asking me about an unarranged overdraft that I was in. So an unarranged overdraft is the really bad one. It's the one where you've gone over your limit and you used to be charged a daily fee, but things have changed a little bit in the way they do things. But so I was incurring a daily fee every day that I stayed in this unarranged overdraft, and she asked me when I would be able to get out of it. And this was the 16th of March, we're right in the middle of the month, and I said, it's going to be payday, it's going to be the end of the month. And she asked me a question that no one had ever asked me before in these limited conversations. I was not talking about money willingly at this point, and she asked me why, and I just heard myself say, there's just no money left. And I came off that call. She was very nice, she was very helpful, and she gave me some good pointers, and she refunded some fees. And I came off that call and I did what anyone in that situation would do, and I started an Instagram account to document my journey out of 27 grand's worth of debt. And I hadn't really realised it, but there's a big space talking about money, especially amongst women on social media, particularly Instagram, now TikTok as well. And it has really become a really interesting space to operate in. But when I first opened the account, I expected to get maybe a handful of followers who might shout at me if I bought too many lattes or something like that. What I didn't expect to happen was for that space, that vessel, to allow me to start exploring some of the emotions and some of the things behind what I saw as quite a superficial situation. And what I also didn't expect to happen was for people to find that interesting and for people to identify and to have a flood of people saying, me too, I have been there and now I'm through it. I am right there now. Oh, you think that's a lot of debt? Check out my credit card balance. So, and then over the course of the next 2 years, I realised that it wasn't really about the money. It was about all of the things surrounding that. And I realised how many areas of my life money had gotten its tendrils into. And instead of just, I worked very hard to pay down those balances, but instead of just focusing on the money, I started to think about the behaviour and the supporting muscles that we never talk about when it comes to money. And I think that for so many people, there is a chasm between where they are and the financial advice and information that they need. And that chasm is shame and fear of judgment and underconfidence. And I was there. I didn't feel like that advice was for me. I felt like I didn't deserve at certain points to have a healthy relationship with money, and I didn't see a way forward until I started working through those other feelings. So what I did when I got through it was I looked back and I thought, I want to start talking about money in a different way, and I want to be able to help anyone who needs it to sort of float across that chasm and get to where they need to go. And I sort of narrowed it down into 5 steps, mainly because you have to, because it's a good book title, but also because having some actionable steps towards what can sometimes feel like an absolutely huge goal. I mean, like, who here has had to save a house deposit recently? It's, you know, some of these things they feel gargantuan, they feel so far away. But the first step that I identified was overcoming all of that financial baggage. So that involves the hardest thing, which is self-forgiveness. So looking, like, hands up if you've ever made a mistake with money, like even just one. So it's actually really common, but it's really hard to forgive yourself. And so much of the time you'll be thinking, oh God, I can't believe I spent that on that. I could be using it for this. And it's also about changing the language that you use. There's so much shame and blame when it comes to money that's been wasted or money that is owed. And but we can reframe that from blame to responsibility. So we stop saying, I'm to blame for this terrible situation, and we start saying, it's my responsibility to sort it out. The second step, another tricky one, is separating your self-worth from your net worth. So we're in late capitalism, and that means that so much of our identity and sense of worth is based on things like our salary, whether we're a property owner or not. All of these things that are really closely tied to money. And I really think for a sense of full financial well-being, we need to try and remove ourselves from that a little bit, because what it's leading to is this hedonic treadmill where we are never satisfied. We're always reaching for the next job, the better job title, the bigger salary, the bigger house, the newer car. And it means that none of us have time to feel content. And that chips away at our self-worth as well. And then when your self-esteem is low, you're more susceptible to these mistakes with money. So it's all really connected. The third step that I had identified, which was really important for me, was to stop trying to use that initial punch of willpower to fuel what was going to be 2 years worth of trying really hard at something. And actually, I learned quite recently that willpower and habits are stored in two completely separate areas of your brain. Your willpower comes from here, your habits come from somewhere in there. And so it's about developing habits and rituals around your practice with money that carve out a path to where you want to go, rather than relying on that initial sort of push of willpower. Because as soon as you get tired or you need that willpower for something else, it runs out, and then you are back to square one. And for a lot of people, they are back to even further away than square one. But yeah, so that's very important. And then the fourth step is about learning to spend mindfully. It's very, very hard to fill a bath if the plug is out. And it's the same with money. You know, most people have a finite amount coming in, but actually you can't complete buying things. There's no... You'll never run out of things to buy. So it's about developing some habits around the fact that, you know, we can think of a thing and have bought it within 20 seconds now on our phones. We can be scrolling through Instagram and we can see 3 things that we like, and the next thing we know, they're turning up on the doorstep. And I think a lot of people especially struggled with this during the pandemic, because all of our other sources of that dopamine hit were gone. Like, people couldn't go to the gym, we weren't spending time with friends and family, and a lot of people really turned to online shopping for that buzz, whether it is, you know, and shopping something that's really gendered. But I also know loads of men who ordered, like, loads of things online. My husband has got so many goalkeeper gloves now. He's never going to get through all of those. He's not even a goalkeeper. He is a goalkeeper. But yeah, so it's about having some mindful practices around our spending. Can we put into place some barriers? Can we have a phone curfew if we find that we spend late evening because we're bored or lonely or tired? Can we create a list of things that we want and leave them there, and then maybe we won't want them again? So cute. I've got a little boy that age. But yeah, can we find an accountability partner where, you know, and that doesn't have to be a formal arrangement, that can be like you phone your sister at 9:30 p.m. and are like, please talk me out of buying this micro handbag that I've seen. It can be anything like that, but we just need to sometimes put some measures in place to stop us from sleep spending and using that money that we work so hard for on things that will be left in their package in the hallway, or things that will be cluttering up our houses and find themselves in the back of a cupboard one day. And then the 5th step is about planning for the future. So I don't know about all of you, but it has been very clearly demonstrated to me in the last 2 years, and then again in the last 2 weeks, how little of my life in the broader sense I have any degree of control over. And so having a plan for the future, having a financial safety net, is something that I really advocate. I think feeling okay financially in the moment is brilliant. Knowing that things aren't going to fall off a cliff in the future is the only way to feel properly sort of financially well. And the two things that people say to me time and time again when I talk about what they want, what would financial well-being look like for them, is freedom and security. And they go hand in hand. You can't really have one without the other. You need to feel secure in order to feel free. And freedom is a really nice side effect of security. And I think that having been through the journey, we have to call it that, there's no other word, I'm so sorry, that I've been through over the past few years, being able to finally look forward instead of looking back when it comes to money is a feeling like no other. And so that's why it's my step 5. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Because Apple equipment's just not that good. Loads of hands flying up. Everybody wants to get themselves out of the horrible hole that we've all got into. I've bought a drum kit. Can't play the drums. 5 guitars. Can't play guitar. You point where you want me to go, and the people will ask you the questions.
Oh.
And you're going to help them.
We can go here.
Hi, thanks. Well, it sounds like there are more people who have this habit than I realised. I identify with so much in your talk, and it's brilliant. And I mean, I spent something like £130,000 on Amazon shit over the course of about 3 years. £130,000 I didn't have, you know, and I'm in the process of extricating myself from that, including 3 identical trumpets and 1 dog ramp. I didn't have a dog. I swear I didn't pay for this husky in order to use the dog ramp when she gets old. But I am all about taking personal responsibility for these things, but also, especially when I think on behalf of other people who've got into these kinds of messes, I'm very aware of how the culture in general, but also retail psychology really makes it very easy to fall into these sorts of messes. And in the case of the Amazon Lightning deals, where, you know, a lot of those purchases that I made, where you had to buy this thing with 80% off within 5 minutes, or you wouldn't get it. Is there a chance to deal legislatively and so on with the worst aspects of retail psychology, because they're not going to do it themselves?
I think you're so right about that. And actually, my background, my previous life was in brand marketing for a luxury interiors brand, and I was so my own customer, and it made things a lot worse. But I think you're right. And actually, what I say to people quite a lot is that not like protecting your financial security is not a passive thing at all. Actually, it's not just a case of not spending. We're having to constantly bat off all of this pressure to buy. You know, it's coming into our inboxes, it's uninvited on all of our social news feeds, and I think it is so insidious. And we're seeing as well what concerns me most. You say about the Amazon Lightning deals, that the time pressure is a huge one, but the other thing that we're seeing now in the era of buy now, pay later is, don't worry, you don't have to pay for this today. Like, future you can pay for it. And I really think that legislatively there is a lot more consumer protection that needs to happen in terms of that time pressure, and also in terms of, you know, the bill passed for FCA regulation for buy now, pay later brands, and they still haven't done it. So I would like to see both of those things happen.
But also a law that you're not allowed to go on Amazon specifically. Who else got a question for Claire? Claire, point where you want me to go, and here we go.
At the start of your speech, you mentioned specifically female, and then there's a point where you made a joke about the boxing, the goalkeeper's gloves.
Mm-hmm.
Surely this is it's not a gender-specific issue. Why do you feel the need to specifically highlight females in shopping, where there's the same issue with men, and maybe more so for men, they've got an embarrassment about over shopping or overspending.
Yeah, I think your point is a really good one, and I was not meaning to be flippant there. My point was more around the fact that actually women are in a bit of a triple bind when it comes to money. So, you know, there is still a big gender pay gap, and then also for a lot of women, me definitely, you know, we're told from a really young age that there's something wrong with us, and then relentlessly flogged solutions. So whether that's makeup, diet products, and I know that all of this happens for men as well, but I think especially, I'm 32, especially when I was growing up, it was so geared towards women. But then I think the third kind of killer bit is that there is this societal narrative that women are frivolous creatures who spend all of their money on shoes and handbags. So I was more sort of talking about the fact that I think in society shopping is really seen as, like, going shopping is really seen as a female thing. But you are right, it is something that men do as well, and can be just as, you know, men can have a disordered relationship with spending just as much as women can. And I think you made a really important point about the fact that maybe it's not as acceptable to talk about that as a man. So that's definitely something for me to meditate on.
Marvellous. I've come towards the back of the room to see if there's any questions here. Would anyone like to ask Claire a question here from the back of the room? Right, well, massive round of applause for Claire Seal, please.
Thank you.
Are you signing books if people want a book? Amazing. So can I get you to take that one back and put it with the others? Thank you so much, Claire. We'll be signing books. If you want to ask more questions, buy a book, help get her out of that debt hole. Every tenner counts, I believe is the thing. So we're now at the end of what you might call the philosophising section of Sunday Papers Live, and we're moving into the more cultural section, I think, is where we're going. This means we're saying goodbye to our lovely friends on YouTube. Bye-bye, bye-bye, bye-bye. Everyone say bye-bye to the YouTube people. Bye-bye, bye-bye. We're getting rid of them. But all those of us who are here in real life, what we're going to do is just enjoy some delicious drinks and enjoy the wonderful sounds of the You and Bleach Trio. So could I please have a huge round of applause for our wonderful, wonderful culture section, who are going to lead us on our little cultural journey.